going to have a reception around 5 o'clock in the Casa de la Guerra, and I hope that you will join us there and you'll have an opportunity to see the sala, the exhibit, and how nicely that has turned out in general. I also want to thank the City of Santa Barbara for allowing us to use this facility, for their cooperation in this event and also in the exhibit. And Edward Cella, who's on the Landmarks Committee. Are you here, Edward? He's in the back. Thank you for your participation. I also want to thank the UCSB Museum of Art, Dr. Marla Burns. I don't believe she's here today, but Dr. Kurt Helfrich is here, and I want to thank him for his participation in the exhibit and today. I'm now going to turn this over to Patrick O'Dowd with just one thought, and that is Aristotle said a few thousand years ago that man is a political animal. I would say that Patrick O'Dowd would change that phrase a little bit to something like this: man is an intellectual animal. And Patrick is a person who likes ideas, and he's a person who's behind this today and put together the panel, was a key player in the exhibit that you'll have a chance to see this afternoon. And I've known him for 28 years, and we've had discussion with ideas interminably, I would say, but also very enjoyably. Also today, just from my perspective, is to have some fun. Ideas is what we're looking for. Play. We want to have some exchange. We want to think about the plaza. So I don't necessarily see this as some combative situation, but we'll see what happens. Patrick, over to you.
Well, I would like to thank you all for coming, because right from this moment onward, we're doing exactly what we're supposed to do in a plaza. If you just think back to the Agora in Greece, this is the place that the polis met in order to discuss the important ideas in the community and make decisions about the community's destiny, and it's really meant to be the heart of the community. So just by being here today, right on this side of the plaza, we've sort of started it, and that's pretty good, I think. Now, the idea is that we're not here to propose what to do in the plaza. We just want you all to think about the plaza. And this all started, at least for me, I had the nice experience of the city-sponsored visioning quest that we went through. And I was one of those participants, as was Edward. And we all began to learn a lot of things about our city. And one of the things that that committee, and I see some of the members here of the committee, was redesign Plaza de la Guerra. So that was one of the issues that the Vision Committee thought about. And if you think about it, we look out there, it's our community's heart, it has a relationship to the community. What is that? So we began a process here, Edward and I, and then we brought in Kurt, and the idea was to bring together all the materials that we could find about the history of the plaza. So if you go over to the Casa de la Guerra, you'll see an exhibit which kind of takes us back to the 1828 when the casa's finished and the family moves in, and tells you the story of the plaza right on through. And you'll find some amazing things about the plaza. The wonderful thing that's over there, and you have to go over and see it, is because David Gebhardt collected all these drawings. Sort of our leading architects are over there. And you need to go over and see those drawings, because they can only come out every once in a while, and they're out now, and they will explain to you how it was that we came to have Santa Barbara architecture, whatever that is. So you need to see those drawings, and they're only going to be there till August 15th. So in order to take part in this dialogue about the plaza, it's important you see those drawings. And then the last section, curated by Edward, is about everything that's happened since 1963. And I've been in the community that long, and I can remember some of these debates that go on about the plaza. So you can start with the nuclear bomb shelter idea, 1963, and move right on through all the controversy about King Carlos and bathrooms and all the other things we sort of have big brouhahas about here in Santa Barbara. So the exhibit is over there as the historical background for raising our consciousness, as we say in in the generation I come from. So that's how we do that. And then what we wanted to do today is to bring to you some people of outstanding renown who think about plazas and their meaning and understand things in the community or in other communities that have to do with the plaza idea. So we're going to have these presentations for about a half an hour, 25 minutes. They'll come up and they'll talk to you about various aspects of the plaza idea. And I want to also inform you that we are not spending any taxpayer money here today. The city's been nice enough to loan us the use of this room, but this effort up to this point, including the exhibit, including the symposium, and including the cookies in the back room and the coffee. If your brain should start to sag, you can go back there and get some cookies and coffee. All of this is a private effort. So from up to this point, we're just trying to think about these things here in the community. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we've brought today. If you look over on the far left, this is Carroll William Westfall. He's the chair of the Department of Architecture in Notre Dame, but he was also there doing this sort of thing at that amazing American architectural place, the University of Virginia, with Thomas Jefferson's great design of a plaza right there at the campus of the university. And so he's going to come and talk to us, and he's been working in Pompeii, and I discovered him, and for myself, Kurt's known him for a long time. I went to Savannah, Georgia, and they were, the community was very proud of its city squares, and they were having a symposium. You might say there were 200 plaza maniacs there, and they were all having a great time, and he had a lot of very interesting things to say, so we wanted him to come to the community and talk to us. And then there's this fellow right next to Carroll Westfall here, who you might know, Dave Davis, and this is a cousin very far away from me, but some of you may not know, but Dave is a great historian. So he's going to tell us a little bit about the relationship between the city and the plaza, and I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. And then following Dave will be someone who's going to talk to us about the very earliest history of the plaza, Dora Crouch, right here. And Dora is a well-known author, and she can tell us about the plan of the Indies and how Santa Barbara first got laid out, the first urban plan for Santa Barbara. It's an amazing story. And then following Dora, we have the pleasure of having David Gebhardt's sidekick, if I could be so presumptuous as to say that. Robert Winter and David Gebhardt wrote a lot of books together that really describe the story of California architecture, guidebooks of Northern and Southern California. And there's a beautiful book recently published by the University of California Press on the arts and crafts movement here in California. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I read that last night. And I'm proud also to say that he is an intellectual historian, a very rare thing today. And last but not least here, we have Wayne Donaldson, the maître d'oeuvre of the train station that's being restored here in Santa Barbara, somebody that the Trust has worked with, one of the best preservation architects in the state of California, knows everything there is to know about preservation. And Wayne's going to come and talk to us about the plaza and tell us why it is that gringo plazas don't work. So without further ado, let me ask Carroll Westfall to talk to us and see what he has to say. Well, the format for the day is the following. Each one will speak for 25 minutes or so. After that, there'll be a cord that comes out and grab them. And then the next speaker will come forward. If you have a little bit of time, we might have one or two questions. When we finish the presentations, then we're going to have an exchange all together and talk about the plaza, public conversation. And then afterwards, I invite you to go to the Casa de la Guerra for reception, a little wine and cheese. If you need some water, it's back there. Coffee's back there. Cookies are back there. So just enjoy yourself and think about the architecture of Santa Barbara and the importance of our plaza. Bill?
Yeah, this is such a comfortable chair. Can you hear me? This is such a comfortable chair. I'm going to stay in it, and I'm not going to show pictures right at the beginning. I'll ask for the pictures in a little bit. I've got a presentation. It's going to take about 75 minutes. And it's not about, well, it'll touch on Pompeii. I've got a picture of Pompeii in here, but what I want to do is to talk about building a good Santa Barbara. I've loved Santa Barbara ever since I grew up in Fresno and used to come over here to see what a city was like. It was when I was in high school, and I'd trot out to the Lobero Theater and blow on my French horn in part of the All-California High School Symphony Orchestra. It was great fun. And Santa Barbara always kind of was there in the background of my understanding of what cities should be, and I've been coming to it for the last 10 years or so, looking at it, trying to understand this question of what makes good cities. I've looked at a number of other places in the meantime and have prepared some remarks that grow out of the background of my present position as chairman of the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame, where we take very seriously the idea that architecture is a way of building cities. And cities are a way of building trust between people and establishing a true civic comity, a true way of living together to improve the lot of everyone, understanding that architecture is a means of doing that. And Santa Barbara illustrates, and the way Santa Barbara was built illustrates this point. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Good cities, cities that we love, cities that we care about, do take a long time to build. Good cities result from the care and attention of people with many different interests. These people work together to get what they want individually, and in the process they produce something that no one of them would have been able to produce alone. And this combination of self-interest and civic interest is what makes a city different from a shopping center and different from a suburb. Today, too many people think that shopping centers are the only place to shop, and suburbs provide the model of how to build residences. But neither shopping centers nor suburbs give people public plazas and other pleasant public places, attractive streets, and a diversity of public activities that supplement the pursuit of shopping and the pleasures of home, not to mention a rich visual texture of buildings and landscaping, streets, vistas, and places where a person can walk and wants to walk just for the pleasure of the walk. They are, in short, that is, shopping centers and suburbs are not the place, cities are not the places where people shop and live. Shopping centers have malls, cities have plazas. Now, we've fallen out of the habit of building cities. Instead, we build shopping centers and we build suburbs. Worse than that, even when we build in cities, we build commercial areas as if they are shopping centers and residences as if they are suburban houses. There are examples here in Santa Barbara, not 4 blocks from here, that illustrate the suburban house mentality. The number of places that have resisted this trend is quite small in this country. One thinks of Charleston, Savannah, Santa Barbara, and not many other places. But these places are very different from one another, although they share 2 qualities. Each of them is cherished by the residents and visitors alike, and each of them has a clear visual character that is very urban, very rich, and very distinct, although very different one from another. Of course, being cherished and being beautiful go together. People love beautiful cities, and these are beautiful cities. In each case, the beauty, the distinctive visual character, is the product of a very self-conscious historical image that has been protected and promoted over several generations. And in each case, that distinctive character is threatened now by the qualities of the shopping center and the suburb. These cities will lose the qualities that make them lovable if the people who see the city only as a shopping center or suburb gain the upper hand. They will lose the qualities we cherish if the people who cannot distinguish between a city and a shopping center and between a city and a suburb are allowed to determine what is built in them. Now, be clear, I am not against commerce. Commerce is the lifeblood of a city, but the civic life is its heart and soul. Commerce is about making a profit. The civic life is about living abundantly, justly, and well. Commerce provides the pleasure of getting a bargain and making a profit, and that is a pleasure. But the civic life provides the happiness we pursue by living a broadly human life, a life laced with enjoyment of family, friends, community, and fellow citizens. In a vital city, beyond commercial prosperity, there must be the pursuit of justice, peace, comity, and social equity. Shopping can kill cities. If the suburban mall or the commercial strips leading out to them suck the commercial vitality from the central areas of an established city, that city is doomed. The people who are left behind in the center will be too poor to shop and too poor to build and sustain the buildings, streets, and plazas that set it apart from the shopping centers and suburbs. Meanwhile, the people who left the city, who no longer shop and live there, will find no reason to continue to pay the price of maintaining its attractive public amenities. Now, there is a difference between the two. There is a true urban culture, and there are shopping centers and suburbs that have invaded the central area. There is a true urban culture, and there is commercial and residential construction in outlying areas. One is about civilization, the other is about shopping. One serves the larger needs of the city and its citizens, the other only the narrower, indeed one can say selfish, ends of the market. We can easily tell which is which by looking. Simply ask, does the builder who built it and the merchant who uses it seek only his or her own ends, or does he or she seek to serve the civic life as well? Does the building merely stand out and proclaim its own importance, or does it contribute to the beauty, order, and comeliness of the urban setting, even as it gains its own distinct place within that urban whole? Briefly put, in the way it presents itself in public, is it a bore or a citizen, an intruder or a neighbor? Now, Santa Barbara, and this point is well made by the exhibition, Santa Barbara is blessed by having been built by those who took their civic role seriously and therefore sought to build a city. The result is the Santa Barbara we love and wish to protect even as we extend and rebuild it. This Santa Barbara is a model of what a community can accomplish when the people living in it, builder, merchant, and citizen, work together, and when the same person combines all three roles in himself. In their work, they build something that serves their own separate interests while also contributing to an overall civic whole, a whole that is clearly visible in the special character and high quality of the buildings, the blocks, the streets, and the plazas. Now, this Santa Barbara did not happen by chance. It did not happen overnight. It was built by a community sharing a vision of what it was like to become, what it should become, a vision embodying a clear and appropriate visual imagery tying together buildings, plazas, and landscape, a vision that was then pursued with clarity and consistency over a long period of time. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the principles and rules of city building which are embodied in Santa Barbara and in other cities. Few cities share the qualities of Santa Barbara, but there are a few, and it is important to understand, and they go back into antiquity. Pompeii, for example. It's important to understand these delightful, beautiful, graceful, urban and urbane places do have certain things in common. The common characteristics are easily identified as 2 principles and 4 rules. That's 2 and 4. And then a few details. Now we'll take the first pictures. The 2 basic principles. Now what are we going to do for lights? Here we go. Okay. The 2 basic principles can be expressed as maxims. The first one is there on the right. Politics is more important than architecture. Yeah, I've got light here. Yeah. There we go. Politics is more important than architecture. The most important building in Santa Barbara is, of course, the courthouse. Second most important building is the one we're in. Buildings in urban places are built to serve civic ends, and these are more important than the private ends of commerce, more important than the self-expression of architects, and so on. Good plazas provide evidence that politics comes first in cities. Next, the second point is that a building is, first of all, a modification of an existing urban setting. Whenever you build in a city, you always build as the second architect, not as the first. You take the existing situation and you improve it. No matter where a person is building, even in the countryside, there is an existing setting that he must account for. He does well when he improves that setting. He does poorly when he degrades it. The Plaza de la Guerra is a perfect example of this, as the exhibit shows. It grew over time, and it continues to be an important topic of conversation. Now, these two maxims have in common the idea that the whole, the city, the urban place, is more important than the piece, the building, the idiosyncratic personal expression of an individual, or anything done in the single-minded pursuit of profit. Let's have the next. If these principles are not honored, then you end up with the view on the right, which is in the same city as the view on the left. These are both from Savannah, but that is commerce from the late 19th century that degrades Broughton Street, and on the left is not 4 blocks away, a part of the town that maintains its integrity. When commerce went to the suburbs, that left behind Broughton Street, and that is a scab in the city of Savannah. Now, these principles give forth 4 basic rules for building. As we modify and expand our American urban areas, these 4 need to be embodied in what we build and how we build. Let's have the next. The first is, commerce must always be civilized. That view on the left is again Savannah, and you can see that the commerce is tucked in on the ground floor. I get my trusty pointer here. Here's the commerce, and it's quite civilized because there's lots of other things happening. When commerce is civilized, it remains subordinate to a larger civil character in the city. In Santa Barbara, commerce is concentrated in the downtown. That's a common pattern. But the public buildings, the county building, the city hall, the post office, the museum, let's have the next. The one that used to be a post office there on the left, or on the right rather, the present post office. These stand out as superior buildings in this city, superior to commerce. Without them, the central area would be a mere shopping center with on-street and mid-block parking. Furthermore, when commerce is civilized, it remains subordinate to the larger urban character of the city. Let's have the next. In Santa Barbara, commerce is distributed in a variety of buildings built at different times under different ownerships and forming parts of streets and paseos and plazas. Next. The alternative is a large building or building complex built at one time, usually owned by a single entity, and looking inward into its own privately owned center or mall. In short, a shopping center. The Paseo Nuevo is such an entity. It's designed carefully adapted to the circumstances of Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara's character, in my view, is strong enough to digest this intruder from the suburbs, but one more like it could choke Santa Barbara. Let's have next. There's a big difference, isn't there? The view of Paseo Nuevo from the original Paseo is meant to show, is meant to show some of the differences. Let's have the next. Another rule is this: the same building components must be used in the public and the private realm and in both architectural and urban applications. Related to this, and illustrated in the slide on the left, is that I'm talking about the traditional architectural forms that took their rise in ancient Greece and have had a continuous history from that time forward to the present day. Santa Barbara is loaded with them. The column is the most obvious example of it. But when you see a column, and these are at the University of Virginia, when you see a column, you're also seeing something that relates architecture here to nature, the tree, because a column is a form of a tree, and to man. These guys are trimming the trees after a big wind. Not one of my speeches, but another kind of big wind. So that you can grasp the size of the building and immediately relate it, both to natural components, such as trees, and to people. Now, the reason that the same building components need to be used in public and in private, and in architectural and urban applications, is to tie everything together, so that the public things can be seen to be more important than their comparable components in private settings, and you can see that the architecture contributes to the urban setting. If the urban things and the architectural things are made from the same components, you can see the continuity. This continuity provides a visual parallel to the way we are expected to behave, more decorously in public, more relaxed in private, but we are the same person in both realms. Let's have the next. In a tradition that reaches back to classical antiquity and includes us, the building components are recognizable. Pompeii on the right, Santa Barbara on the left. And they are easily recognized as certain components, that is, colonnades, arcades, and so on. They are always distinct. You would never mistake Santa Barbara for Pompeii, nor Pompeii for Santa Barbara, and I could put in here Charleston and Savannah and University of Virginia and other such places. And with a trained eye, a little bit of experience in looking at these places, you know instantly where you are. Each will be distinct, but each will be distinct to a general category as well. And following this rule, architects must work with the forms that are traditional to civility and urbanism, and hence tie our cities back to the entire tradition, just as our United States Constitution ties us back to ancient Greece and Rome. Let's have the next. A very difficult one to work with is this one. Whatever is done beyond the center has its complement in the center. Following this rule will enrich and is meant to enrich the public realm. For example, a person builds a pool house in his back garden, but he also donates a new fountain for the library courtyard. That's the downtown library. The person who plants 4 trees in his front yard also contributes to the planting in the central area. The person who adds to his house in one of the neighborhoods contributes to the landscaping of the courthouse square. In this way, individual acts benefit the private life in the outer districts, but they enrich the community focus in the center, in the central area. Now, this rule obviously embodies the principle of philanthropy. The donations of individuals might be made as voluntary contributions, which allows a person to receive individual credit for doing public good, or it can be done through the more anonymous method of taxation, but there you want to make sure that the money that comes from taxes is used for the genuine, general public good. The next principle, next slides please, is that landscape and architecture are always in a dynamic reciprocal relationship. Now, this is true in America. It's not true in Europe. It has become more common in Europe since the 18th century, but earlier cities and cities elsewhere treated the landscape as an alien setting separated from the city by walls. But America was settled within a landscape that cities converted from wilderness to garden, without treating the garden they made as a hostile environment. Thus, the American house, as you all know, sits in a little garden. And so does the house common to all of us, the courthouse. Next, trees line streets and buildings front them, and buildings without trees and other landscape elements in front somehow seem nude. That's why you get the little potted plants, right? What this means is that the slot of the street, shown there on the left, is a whole design entity. It runs from building, the house back in there, to the private landscape, to the tree, to the street, to the tree, to the landscape, to the house. And that becomes a design component. That is a public area. Instead of a bunch of houses, one after another, you have actually an extended plaza. And landscaping is fundamental in doing that. Now, these form a single package, even though within that package, some elements are clearly private while others are part of the public realm. If one or another is missing, the absence is sensed. Now, those are the 4 rules, but to produce something special, you have to use these rules in a quite special way. And when that skill of using them in a special way is present, you have some sort of thing that what I call a telling detail. Let me show you some telling details next. In Santa Barbara, the linkage between El Paseo and the Plaza de la Guerra is animated by telling details. One of them is right there, which on the plan is right here. It's the planting right in there. This photograph from a couple of years ago before it was completed, and now, of course, that would be a much more, with the Plaza de la Guerra, with the adobe open, the connection between it and the plaza is even more forceful. This is exactly the place where there ought to be very special telling details, because this is the plaza that has the city hall on it. This is the civic plaza of the city, and here's commerce. And so we see a very important dynamic relationship between those two. What we see here is a plaza artfully inserted within the grid of the city, with the plaza slightly off-center from the adobe, but that allows for the gap here leading back to El Paseo to be on line with this side over here, something very nicely played up, and which it took, if you look at the exhibition, took many, many iterations over a couple of decades to get that to happen right. But what happens is that in this gap right here, next slides, what you have is this planting right here, standing in front of City Hall where we are, looking down the street of Spain. You have an indication on that street, on the Delegate street, you have an indication that there's something inside. That setback, that little bit of planting leads you inside to the street of Spain and hence into the interior of the block. This is a very important little telling detail that could easily be lost sight of and in a more clumsy design, but is very important and richly developed. Let's have the next. The problem in Santa Barbara is how to get people into the interior of these blocks. These are very large blocks, 500 feet square. Very big blocks with a lot of animation inside, so how do you get them in? The 1960s, I believe it is, addition to the Paseo, shown over here, illustrates how that happens. Again, a telling detail. Most of the commercial along State Street is 2 stories high with roofs up above. What better place for a roof than up above, but not sliding down like this. And with a break in that pattern, with the roof coming down and a 2-story projection upward, you have an indication that something important is happening inside. The facade of that entrance to El Paseo is a very important telling detail that helps to animate the street and get you into the interior. Also, something that helps, I don't have a good detail here, but you all know this place, and that's the way these shop fronts are beveled to enlarge the opening and sweep you in. Now there's another example of a telling detail scoring a victory over the lure of traffic channels. At least there used to be, next on both sides. It's interesting to see it's gone now. But in the 1200 block of State Street, there used to be this little arbor that came out over the sidewalk, and then if you stood in the street and looked in, you would find parking lot number 6 back there. So that a very simple little trellis of absolutely no architectural merit, that is just a couple of concrete piers and some timbers, opened up that interior block in a very telling way. And now it's gone. I don't know what they plan to do with it. It's coming back. Good. Next on both sides, because what that does is to open up, let's see if I can find where we are here. We're going to be up in here, aren't we? That opens up this to here, and then that opens up this trellis here, which is more overgrown than it was a few years ago when I took this photograph, to the block in here, which gets you into all of this and across to the county building. A very important connection across those traffic arteries, emphasizing the interior of the blocks and showing how important small details in the larger scheme of urban design are when you're making urban design work. Next on both sides. So that as you get into the interior of the block, again, I'm sorry for these slides, they're back in a December visit, but a little dark. But what happens in the interior of that block then is a shot through to the county building, and then that generous archway into the landscaping in the interior. It took a long time to build this also, many generations, to get those parts to work. Little increment by little increment. One big ownership wouldn't do it, one big design wouldn't do it. And that's how it always is in cities we love. What this shows is that the urban whole is more important than the individual pieces. The pieces contribute to the whole. In like manner, the city is more than the citizen, and the citizen is completed and his potential fulfilled by his involvement with the city. Whether we are talking about buildings or people, the whole we value most intensely is the public realm where we pursue our happiness in the civic life. Commerce supports the city, but it must not dominate it, just as the street, the square, and the block and the plaza are more important than the individual freestanding isolated building contributing to the street, the square, the block, the plaza. To build that kind of city requires that we recognize that while commerce is the lifeblood of the city, the civic life is its heart and soul. To build a city on that basis requires the skillful use of laws regulating our building and rebuilding in the city. Now you can turn the lights on. I've got the last third here. You can turn the slides off, and I'll talk a little bit about the law in Santa Barbara, and this is a very rough sketch. Now it is common knowledge that the Santa Barbara that we admire is not the product of unregulated building activity. Indeed, all cities in America have building and zoning codes. Most of them are flawed, and most of them seek only the general health and welfare of the community. In Santa Barbara, as in Charleston and Savannah for that matter, the laws have done better because they have sought more. David Gebhard chronicled how present-day Santa Barbara came into being, and I'll spend just a moment giving some background. And I will stand to be corrected by those who know better. He explained that already in 1909, a group of citizens interested in promoting the Hispanic character sought by their predecessors, an idea going back in the late 19th century, had formed the Civic League. Its purpose was to promote a distinct image of the city. Interest in this project gained force soon after World War I, when rapid building and rebuilding was in the offing. To protect the city's physical character, another small group of citizens embarked on a more concentrated program involving education of citizens and of the public about the benefits of establishing planning and design controls, and they sought enactment of local legislation to secure those controls. Linked with that effort was the production and exhibition of drawings, some of which are an exhibit now in the Casa, of drawings showing what the results of unified planning and design could bring into being, as well as the construction of an actual project embodying that vision, namely the Plaza de la Guerra and El Paseo, that is, their proposals for what it should look like. They also provided advice on plans submitted voluntarily by builders, and they persuaded the banks and other lending agencies, I don't know whether this would be legal now, but they persuaded banks and other lending agencies not to make loans on unvetted, on unreviewed designs. Gebhard also documented the various private steps and official governmental responses leading to the present legal structure promoting and protecting this character. Now, here I wish to expand his portrayal to stress 2 points. One concerns the role public buildings played in that chronicle. The other pertains to the interaction between private initiatives and public responses. Now, from the earliest moments in 1921 and 1922, when James Osborne Craig and George Washington Smith and Luda Maria Riggs were working out their ideas for the commercial complex they would call El Paseo, they had in mind its connection with the Plaza de la Guerra. They were two things at the same time, one design of both parts. They intended that on that plaza, the new City Hall would be the most prominent element near El Paseo. The siting and the design of the building placed on that site did indeed provide a forceful link, as I showed you, between their purely commercial enterprise and the center of local government. This link signaled that the central area of Santa Barbara was no simple shopping center. It was a civic center with an attached commercial complex. The builders of El Paseo worked at a time when commerce was king, but in their work, the king was shackled by the law. Local law exercised control over the monarch, a reality that is powerfully rendered in urban form by the prominent siting and design of the building we are in right here. Commerce obeys the law, while City Hall breaks it. El Paseo, in other words, is tucked within a block, while City Hall extends an arcade over the sidewalk, the only new building allowed to do so. That arcade shelters pedestrians. It produces additional prominence for a relatively small building, and it allows the building to reach across the street toward El Paseo. And it also, I learned this morning, recalls the plan of the building that was here before this building was built. And that was the justification for allowing that extension over the sidewalk. The civic and the commercial interact, but the civic enjoys superiority over the selfish ends of the builders. Now, this same relationship is quite clearly visible elsewhere in this area. Note that among all the buildings making up the El Paseo Plaza de la Guerra complex, the buildings devoted to commerce were and are the less important in both the civic order of the city and in the urban and architectural design. The publicly owned open space, the plaza, and the buildings most devoted to public service are the most important ones. In this way, the pattern was more like the one found in traditional urbanism, and I'm sure Dora Crouch will talk about this, and less like the one found in the building of commercial areas elsewhere in the country in the booming 1920s. This occurred because the guiding force behind the activity in Santa Barbara was a group of people involved principally in private commercial affairs, but devoted to a larger civic good. Their success demonstrates that when the civic good is identified with the commercial good, when private acts are seen as ways of producing public value, commerce can build a good city. Now, their success is exemplary. They recognize that commerce could not do it alone. To prevent the common pattern from overwhelming their efforts, they developed a program to make other citizens aware of the importance of planning and finding a way to embody that program into law. Without the law in the form of local ordinances requiring design review, Santa Barbara would be no different from any other city commerce was building in America at that time. Now, of course, the earthquake of June 29, 1925 facilitated their efforts. With the city in a shambles, a rapid rebuilding was inevitable, with the resulting character unpredictable. The protectors of the vision of the city pressed for, and on July 17, just 18 days after the earthquake, they received legislation requiring that a board of architectural review would render judgment on all building permits to assure that they would contribute to the vision. During the next 8 months, the board passed on 2,000 sets of plans. Unsuitable designs were redesigned at no cost by a community drafting room, which was said was manned by the best available talent from nearby cities, presumably some local also. A group that also provided plans at cost or for free. All right. The ordinance referred to itself as an emergency measure. Its repeal 8 months later, February 4, 1926, after the initial wave of Reconstruction and a change in the political climate, suggests that perhaps only the special circumstances ushered in by the earthquake made its passage possible. But its repeal, interestingly, had little effect on the design of the city. The review it required had proven its value, and the board continued to exert its influence as an unofficial body well into the period when construction tapered off during the Depression and ceased after World War II. Now, at the end of World War II, leaders in the community foresaw an emergency similar to the one following the earthquake. Rapid rebuilding following the long hiatus would produce a rebuilt city with an unpredictable character. The original protectors of the vision had passed from the scene, so in mid-1946, the Chamber of Commerce, mind you, the Chamber of Commerce, took the lead. It circulated a pair of questions to leading civic groups, seeking their response and urging whatever action they thought the response warranted. Do you believe, I love these questions, do you believe, 1, that architectural harmony in the business areas of Santa Barbara is essential to promote the economic and cultural welfare of the community? 2, that the city government should take action to secure and maintain architectural harmony in Santa Barbara business areas? Those are the questions. Who would dare say no? The Rotary Club, the Retail Merchants Association, the Santa Barbara Lions Club, the AMVETS, and the Santa Barbara Advertising and Merchandising Club responded with petitions presented to the City Council on October 17 and November 7. The AMVETS petition declared, "Recent developments are indicative of a need for the earliest possible action." Who knows what they had in mind? Must have been drastic. While the retail merchants pointed out that tourism and the commerce it brought with it was the city's principal industry. Here again, the commercial interests sought controls to promote their own interest, and the controls they sought were vested in local ordinance rather than in mere voluntary associations, covenants, or agreements among themselves. Now, the ordinance they obtained in January 1947 has been in continuous force with amendments, extensions, expansions to include historic preservation and other revisions ever since. Now, remember that except during the emergency period following the earthquake, that vision had been implemented without the assistance of law as the result of a civil comity, a circumstance, it seems likely, that resulted from the appeal exercised by the vision promulgated earlier in the century. That is to say, beautiful pictures can move citizens. Beautiful pictures made by architects, showing what can be done if we work together. Certainly the generation that built according to that vision produced something its successor generations understood was a prize worth having, and so it enacted a law to protect and extend it, even though such a law, and this is the point I'm emphasizing, even though such a law would curtail the activities of those who enacted it. Like any good law, it bound the community to a common pursuit that benefited the community. The law the individuals made stood above any particular individual. That's democracy. Commerce often seeks the protection of the law, usually to reach the ends of individual merchants rather than the ends of the community. But in Santa Barbara, the law served a better, higher end. The business interests sought that protection in favor of an architectural harmony that they believed was good for business, and it was also good for the city. And they were right in doing so, and their actions can provide a model for ours today. Today, the principal industry in Santa Barbara is what? Tourism, commerce, and the prosperity arising from the retail activity it generates. Then is now one of the results of the linkage between commerce and law is an extension of the high quality of the urban character beyond the confines of the commercial center that is most strictly regulated by the law. Now, those things are the same, but other things are very different now. The law put into place in the 1920s and again in the 1950s concerns the design of individual buildings. It did not reach into the control of public places, and it did not address the relationship between public and private buildings. It did not need to then, because at that time there existed a general understanding about such things. People understood that public things were more important than private things. The civic was superior to the commercial, and the commercial served and made possible the civic. They also knew how to render that understanding in what they built. But today there is no such general understanding. Today, any commercial activity is taken to be good for the city. This is so even when the massive or extensive buildings it says it requires overwhelm the public places, such as streets and plazas, and thereby degrade the quality of public places, and we see this in city after city. And this is so even at a lesser scale when the obvious commercial emphasis of the design degrades the civic content that civic architecture, whether public or private, must have. Today, design review of individual buildings is inadequate to protect the quality of the urban setting in which we pursue a civil life in public. That is, when we seek something more than the pleasure that comes from finding a good buy and making a profit. Needed is a broader vision of what the physical form and character of the city as a whole must embody, along with the means of assuring that as we build, we embody that vision, a vision that tells us the difference between a city and a shopping center, between a city and a suburb. That vision exists in concrete form in the Santa Barbara brought into being through following that earlier vision. Those who built it made certain that the public benefited from their private acts. They knew the difference between the lifeblood of commerce and the civic heart and soul. They believed their individual projects were parts of a larger whole, and they recognized that a city is different from and better than a shopping center in a suburb. We could do no better than model our actions on theirs. Thank you.
Well, that was a little longer than the 25 minutes I was expecting, but it was very interesting.
Shorter than the 75 I said.
And I remind you that there's coffee and cookies in the back there.
Patrick, there's also about 10 seats in the first 3 rows.
Yeah, people want to sit.
And there are 10 seats in the first 3 rows for those of you that are standing up.
Yeah, can I borrow that?
Sure.
So come on in, cozy in. So let me introduce to you to my distant cousin here from the northern confines of French Canada, a lover of forts and history, as well as our community development director, Dave Davis.
Thank you, Patrick. I was going to tell Carol that I spent a week in South Bend researching my relatives who were the commandants at Fort St. Joseph up in Niles, Michigan. Yeah, I just don't have a voice today. First, I want to apologize for, I went to Washington for a week and came back on the airplane, and the guy behind me coughed the entire way back. And within a couple of days, I developed a severe head cold. And so if I have to catch my breath as I'm going through this today, bear with me. I have a less, structured program than probably the rest of the speakers. I am very honored to be on the dais with people of such high intellectual quality. I'm a low bureaucrat here in the city, toil day to day. And boy, listening to what Carol had to say, and I was going, yes, yes, yes. Right, and I was thinking how hard it is to do all that, because politics, you said politics is number one. It's also the thing which makes things really hard to get things done. I'm actually going to, Patrick turns off the lights, I'm going to come stand on there so I can do my own slides, because if I don't, they won't go in the right order. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Davis. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Santa Barbara. I've been here since 1978. A lot of people in this room know a lot more about the history of planning in Santa Barbara than I do. And so as I go through this presentation, you can correct me, add to the things that I have here or whatever. Next. Planning in Santa Barbara can be explained in one slide. That's me up there pointing. I'm trying to how to get out of here. And Carol, you talked about people caring about communities, and this is the result. But or I shouldn't say the result. This is the process. The end result is the wonderful city that we see out there today. Next. Very quickly, planning in Santa Barbara, I believe, is a tradition, and I believe that I'm just one in a long line of people who have been involved in the efforts to build the civilization and the civic comedy that Carol talked about here in Santa Barbara. And I'll start with the early years, and I'll start right at the head of the class, Dr. Pearl Chase. She was still alive when I first came here. Mary Lou Days is here, introduced me to her, I think, the first week I was here. And I was very, I learned a lot real fast. Dr. Chase was involved in the early efforts here to coalesce citizen efforts. And I must say that a lot of the planning efforts, and Carol hit on it, even the Chamber of Commerce, a lot of the early planning efforts were done privately, not by the city. The city was very busy building commerce, right? And it was the civic efforts of neighborhood groups, business groups, which really led to a lot of the wonderful things that we have here today. It was committees down in East Beach in the 1920s that commissioned the Olmsted Plan that basically gave us the idea that this waterfront ought to be opened to the public and not simply a wall of privately owned buildings. And Carol helps me because he went through the concepts of the Plans and Planting Committee, who had actually built a concept or a construct for a new type of city here in Santa Barbara, which was then facilitated by the earthquake in 1925. And out of that, of course, New Spain rose from the rubble. I miss those post-war years of the chamber, and that's a good link for me, because I then pick up basically with the general plan, and we had Simon Eisner, who at the time actually was pretty much out there on the cutting edge, and we were very lucky that our general plan here was done in a way which gave us at least a lot of head start on doing things the right way. And a lot of the right way was looking backwards rather than looking forwards and trying to modernize. It looked back again to what makes cities work over time and build upon the traditional values which were there. The impacts of growth, I'm sorry, I skipped over something. The parking district and State Street renovation, really, and the one part which was missed there in terms of the commerce versus the civic qualities of the city. The parking district and State Street renovation, and even Paseo Nuevo, was the attempt by the community to forestall the suburbanization that you had in other places and trying to integrate them in to that fabric. And rather than having simply a down, and I'll show you some pictures, a straight downtown, State Street was to be a garden. And it was to do exactly what you're talking about, Carol, in terms of building between the building, the landscaping, the street, the pedestrian, a vital link that basically, if you will, brought everything together. And the way to do that was to get the car off the street and put it behind the buildings, assuming the car was still going to be there. The impacts of growth went into, in 1975, went into questions of how big can we grow before simply the mass starts to become cancerous and starts to die. The voters actually in 82 and 89 passed charter sections which basically mandated by law that we try to live within the resources and to balance the efforts we have here between neighborhood preservation and economic development. And lastly, I'm going to tell you, one of the biggest benefits which have happened to planning since I've been here in the last 20 years is in the area of historic preservation and the Landmarks Committee. When I came here in 78, it had just basically been, formed in 77 as a committee. And there had been landmark work done before, but the landmarks ordinance was, I think, adopted in 77. I mean, could be wrong, but close. But in the 80s, that was put into the city's charter. And I got to tell you that in terms of solidifying the city's goal that the downtown, the character of Santa Barbara, would be embodied through the Historic Landmarks Commission's efforts and goals, I believe probably is one of the larger efforts to develop that sense of Santa Barbara that everybody cares about here in the community. So, very quickly, let's see what happens. We didn't always look like we do today. But we did, let's see if I can get this to work, we did have mass transit. And of course, we had a dearth of landscaping back in that period of time. And then along came the automobile, and we replaced the carriage with the horseless carriage. And believe it or not, that is State Street. Wait, oh, I did that. We still had mass transit. There were all sorts of mass transit back in those particular days, including a tremendous rail system. And I know Christine recently had one of the trolley stops made a landmark. Landmarks Committee did that, and Council adopted that to recognize the effort that was there. And of course, all of those systems are gone. They've been replaced to some degree by our electric shuttle. It's a new type of system that kind of does that. But in 1925, along came the earthquake. And for those of you who haven't seen the pictures, this could happen again. So when you see us dealing with things like the Guerra Hotel and saying that in fact those are dangerous buildings and need to come down, yeah, there are a lot of social issues dealing with those particular buildings. But this will happen again at some point in time. This is not San Francisco or Northridge. This is downtown Santa Barbara. Okay, and the architectural drawing room Carol talked about, those particular drawings became the models, if you will, for the rebuilding of State Street. Now, you talked about the hope that there were some locals. This is the Allied Architects Association of Los Angeles. And of course, even in the 20s, Los Angeles was a reviled term in this part of the coast. But out of that, and again, all of those permits that were issued the next year came the buildings which looked very, very much like those particular plans which were made. And actually, you used, I think, that particular arch in one of your pictures there. In that sense of, if you will, an urban village, which comes out of this style of architecture, I've always loved this view down the street because to me, it really says Santa Barbara in so many ways. And the courthouse, to me, in terms of those public spaces, is the epitome is the epitome of basically the public buildings and spaces which came out of that civic effort of the Plans and Planting Committee. And most of you know that the sunken garden was the foundation and the basement of the original courthouse, and this new concept of building around it. And what makes a courthouse work? There are no cars. If you put a parking lot where the green space is today, and the courthouse loses most of its charm, not all of it, but much of it. State Street, and I talked a little bit about the garden effort. It wasn't always as it looked today. You could buy things at 10 cents back in those days. We didn't have Paseo Nuevo, we had Woolworth. But we had, and it's hard, it's even hard for me to imagine. I came here to go to school in the 60s, and this was like this when I first got here in 66, and it's hard for me to remember. 4 lanes of traffic, parking on each side of the street. It's very, very difficult to remember that. I mean, I'm not that old, but I mean, it's like, that was pretty much just yesterday. Simon Eisner, through the general plan, basically came up with the concept that State Street really ought to be a garden and a place for celebration within the city. And he, within the general plan, recommended the ultimate conversion of the present downtown plaza to a full-fledged paseo by eliminating vehicular traffic from State Street. That particular section has been stricken from our general plan. And I can't say that it's all bad, because I got to tell you that's a long stretch of retailing, a long paseo, and a lot of space. And to some degree, having the vehicular in there the way we do, very quietly, to go through the middle, somehow works. And there's a lot of places, and if anybody's from Santa Monica, oh, Paul, you're from Santa Monica, 3rd Street works, but it's a lot of space. And I don't know, I like State Street. I think it works. And it is a garden, and yes, we are redoing this area, but the trellis is coming back. The other thing that Mr. Eisner really suggested, and it was really incredible, that it was the business community which did it. It said that basically take the backs of these buildings where you had a lot of private parking, right, and turn them into public parking lots and paseos, right? And of course, we have taken that effort to the nth degree. We have parking structures, no one knows they're parking structures, and you can't find them. Tourists come to town and don't realize that that is a 500 car parking structure. But again, integrating with business and doing facades and making it pedestrian scale in the street. But it's the character of development, it's the historic character, and that's where I think landmarks is very critical. I've been here long enough to see, I'll just, it's a Saturday, I only have 2 council members, there's no quorum here. I've seen good landmarks committees and I've seen bad landmarks committees, right? And I got to tell you that in the last 10 years we've been blessed because, in fact, one, we've gone through a tremendous building spurt in the late 80s into now. And had we had some of the committees that we had back in the late 70s, we would have paid a price. And it's irretrievable. You showed that picture in Savannah. It's irretrievable. Once it's done, it's done. There are major projects, 2 council people who are here, Planning Commission members and Historic Landmarks Committee members. There are projects which we're working on right now which are very big, very massive, all to be built at one time. They're going to change the character of Santa Barbara. And I'm really looking to all of you to be the leaders to deal with making it work. But anyway, it's that character that landmarks has bring. And if you will, the devil's in the details, and that's what landmarks really is good at. There are other public spaces other than the street. That's the wharf. Does everybody know that? It was a lumber yard where the park is today, right? And this is all industrial area here, right? This is the old Cabrillo Boulevard, right? It's hard to even know that that's Santa Barbara. The real old harbor restaurant, right? Back when there were still oil things out on the wharf. And of course, as you all know, back in the 70s, the harbor restaurant was destroyed by fire. Well, how many proposals did the city have basically to make it Pier 39, right? There were proposals to make it Restaurant Row all the way out. Commerce would have won. But in fact, the city opted over time to create a very modest commercial presence on the wharf, and the rest of the wharf is dedicated open space. It is a plank park which is different. It's for people. It's a civic space as well as providing the economics which are there. Very important. Can the city afford to refuse this land? We're not talking Wilcox. This was back when, in fact, Chase Palm Park was originally purchased by the city. And all that, there's that lumber yard along the beach. And the really question was, would the city be willing to pony up, to float bonds, to buy the waterfront? Think about what that waterfront would be today if the people, the citizens of this community back then, had not had the wherewithal to vote yes and to go forward with that. And the south side of Cabrillo Boulevard instead were hotels, like most other beach cities in the world, not just in the country, in the world. Unbelievable foresight, such that today, you literally, at least in the main part of town, if not below the bluffs, you can go from one part of the city line to the other part of the city line all the way through on public property, right? There's not many places, again, in the world that can say that. How did that happen? That happened because the citizens of this community had vision. They had leadership at the time. Okay, I guess I have another slide there. Okay. Some of you may recognize this. Back in the 80s, council member, then Mayor Hal Conklin, had a thing called the Renaissance Fund. He put together a document, and he tried to articulate what makes Santa Barbara special, what makes, again, going to Carol's point, what makes the city really work. He went to say, what makes Santa Barbara really work? And he said, basically, there's a sense, here we have a sense of place, there's a sense of time, a sense of encounter, and a sense of celebration. And out of that, we developed a vision for the 90s. And I'd like to, again, hit the lights again, Patrick. We're going back in the slides. Okay. The sense of place. I mean, when you're in Santa, well, you don't have to be in Santa. You see pictures and you know you're in Santa Barbara. We have a sense of who we are and have developed that through our architecture such that that sense of place. I got to tell you, when we had the visioning quest, as somebody said the other day, Nick Welsh calls it KWESD, the vision quest. When you bring visitors here, don't you all bring them downtown, walk them through all of the Hispanics buildings, and aren't you proud of what's here? When we went through that vision process, what was really, if you will, heartwarming to me was that the citizens community, and I don't care if they're business, commerce, educational, religious, neighborhood, or what, they all felt the same way about what has been created here in Santa Barbara. And very frankly, they all want to protect it in one way or another. Nobody's very, very far apart, right? It's on how you do it. Sense of, oh God, that's Street of Spain, one of the more classic places. It is really too bad I went to Office, and I understand why. But it was a great retailing space. A sense of time. Jerry. We have a sense of time here. We try in very many ways to respect all cultures and what they've contributed to this place. It's not just the Spanish colonial period, but we try very hard to recognize everything. This is something which I think we're starting to lose, right? And I'll put this on the table for all of you leaders in the community, that sense of encounter. And I know we really try hard in new projects to create those places for people to encounter in Santa Barbara. But it's getting harder and harder to do, I think. Economics and building techniques, and there's a lot of different reasons. But that sense of encounter, which is something, even the Chamber back when did a survey of LA people, like what do they like about coming to Santa Barbara? And it was like finding little hidden places. That's something it wasn't just the shopping mall, wasn't a typical place. There was something special about all those little nooks and crannies. Getting harder to do that, okay? Maybe it's just encountering a good coffee place along the street because, again, that whole sense of the streetscape, especially since we did public dining on the street, I think has really enlivened the town and the sense of the encounter of Santa Barbara. Oh, it's the top headline, not the bottom. This is the first Fiesta. And Fiesta was big, but they didn't know exactly what to put as the top headline. We have a sense of celebration in this town that we carry again to the ultimate extreme. It's and that's one of the things which I love about this place is the fact that this place really is always celebrating a sense of itself. And I think all of you need to pat yourselves on the back, because I got to tell you, this community is more involved in these kind of celebrations of who we are, right, than any place I know in the world. And it's just a fantastic place to be. We even celebrate how we eat our food. Okay. We did do a vision for the 90s, which tried to build upon all of the things that we've learned from the past. And we talked about that urban village atmosphere. One of the things we really wanted to do was see more mixed use downtown. It's not just commerce, it's also where you live. And if you have people downtown, then you need green spaces, and you need schools, and you need markets. You actually need a little city on top of the city. We'd really like to see that happen. We want to encourage the mom and pop retail stores. We don't necessarily need Nordstrom, even though most people were fairly happy that it came. The pedestrian, I gotta go back. The pedestrian emphasis, we needed to build upon that to expand the successful electric bus system. And I got to tell you, because we got a couple council people here in the audience here today who have been working on doing that, and just recently, and it didn't get a lot of publicity yet, we just recently basically have gotten funding through the County Association of Governments for a major expansion to the electric shuttle system, which will tie together City College to downtown, the east side, the west side, La Cumbre to downtown, University to here, and us to Carpinteria. And a shuttle that goes around Goleta. Major effort. And I got to think that that's really, I mean, it's on the cutting edge, and it's really a big deal. And they've been fighting to do it, and I think we're just on that cusp of, we've got the funding. Gary Gleason goes, buy those buses, we're going to make it happen, right, Gil? Big deal, okay? Now, enhance and expand Delegate Plaza is our city's central courtyard. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a second, right? When do we do this? 91, right? Well, geez, we're almost pushing 10 years, and not a lot's happened. And I must compliment the trust for lighting the fire under the community to think about that again in so many ways. Experience of cultural diversity, and again, in so many ways, this is, all of you go to Oak Park, you know how diverse this community is and how we like to celebrate that. Creating an arts and cultural district, and I'm going to make at least a couple statements that that's probably tied together with the Civic Plaza. The most important thing we can do in the next 10 years is try to make those things happen. Forget about retail, forget about hotels, forget about timeshares. If we don't do anything in the next 10 years, do the cultural district, build upon that downtown, the cultural aspects, not just of performing arts, but historic aspects of culture and the civic spaces that we have. And this place will be great for the next millennium for a long time. Okay, and we worked on the theaters, and that's all part of that thing. Okay, now I'm going to, few kind of closing comments, because I think I'm shorter than most. What's the next millennium you're going to call it? This is the 90s? What's the next thing? Well, I call it the aughts, right? Because you know, the aught 9, right? They use that. Did they turn a century? They use that. Okay? And the reason I did that was because where we are right now in terms of urban planning thinking, you hear this term all the time. I subscribe to it, basically. New urbanism, right? And it talks about how we got to like get rid of the car. We got a mixed use, everything I've just talked about, downtown, live and work in a little neighborhood, traditional neighborhoods. But the way it's been developed to a large degree by practitioners, such as myself, is you ought to do this and you ought to do that. And what we get is, you know, spare me. It's changing my lifestyle too much. And people can't see that. How can you change the values that we've developed over time and the way that we do business and live and whatever? Transit and parking, frankly, people like their car, right? It is so convenient. I think we do shuttle systems and stuff. We're going to make a big dent in making people look at the alternative. But car ain't going to go away. So I think, at least as a planner, I'm still looking at, like, how do I make it work? I look at State Street. I could take it all off State Street, or I could slow it down, narrow it, constrain it, but still let it happen. Okay? So I got to think that that's a tough issue. Density. Let's see, half the people in this room have opposed projects that had densities in their neighborhoods, right? That's a big issue in this town, because density means people, means congestion, and it frightens people. And there's enough architects in here, in this room also, that can tell you that density isn't frightening. Density actually can be enlivening. But you have good quality and you got bad quality. And, you know, that's a tough issue. Density is a tough one. Banks and financing, right? They're almost as bad as politicians and planners. They're looking backwards. Rather than looking forwards, they're making loans based upon the types of investments which happened in the last decade. They can't look forward, right? They are so risk averse that, in fact, you can't get anything that's going to change. Financing doesn't work, okay? And lastly, for those of you who grew up in my generation, right, you're fighting that whole syndrome of white picket fences and little pink houses for you and me. That's a song, by the way. What's that city? Daly City. It's a song about Daly City and all those houses that are on the hill, right? People have their choices. That's what they want, right? And if they can get it and it's affordable, they will choose that over multiple family living every single day. So again, got to work on how we deal with that particular issue. But you can't get from there, because of that, to where you need to be. Okay? However, another song, but this one's from the 60s. You don't need a weather vane to know which way the wind blows. Who sang that? Bob Dylan. Come on. Where is it? There's things happening, folks. And as a planner, I see them happening. I want to stand up to the community and go, look, we gotta move. We gotta do something with this. But it's hard to get people motivated. Demographic change. California is not today, nor will it be tomorrow, the California of yesterday, right? Economically, ethnically, and in terms of the amount of change which we are going to see in the next decade, in terms of demographics, right? Young, old, you name it. This is a different state. And we're still, again, doing politics based upon yesterday. Technology, okay? I'll be the first to tell you we have too much retail in this town. That in the next 20 years, retailing is going to change dramatically. And, you know, I can say it on a Saturday and I'll say it on a Tuesday someday. Upper State's probably going to die. It is going to die. You can build all the parking you want, but there's too much retailing in the town. And with the beach, and with Paseo Nuevo, and with the Civic Center, right, the northern end of State Street, it's got to change. And it's going to change into mixed use. It's going to change into other smaller types of offices. It's going to be much more of a neighborhood rather than just an extension of the commercial core, right? That's its future, right? It isn't going to be Nordstrom. It is not going to happen, right? And we may spend $15 million trying to make it happen, but we're like good generals. We fight the last war, and we only know basically how to solve the retail problems of the 80s. We don't even know what to do with respect to the aughts. Global economics, does it affect us? Sure it does. We don't think it does, right? But when they started laying off all those folks out in Goleta and things really changed back in 92, 96, right? You saw a lot of change in this community from things which are happening globally. And I got to think, and I got to bet with Paul here, that global economics still is going to play a role in terms of national economics in this country. And we're not out of the woodshed in terms of where we're going in terms of the international financial crisis and how good these times really are. So we got to be careful. Lastly, I'm a big believer that we're going to really try to go back to traditional values with non-traditional families. I'm in a non-traditional family. I'm a stepfather and all that kind of stuff, right? But I think we all are striving to get back to very traditional family values. And I'm also a believer that architecture is one of those things which makes that happen. One of the things which is very attractive to new urbanism is the traditional neighborhood concept of knowing your neighbor and interacting with them at the little mom and pop grocery store on the corner and what have you. I think that's something which, if we don't start dealing with in our planning efforts on a bigger, broader scale, tough times ahead. Okay, it's kind of to close out a little bit. Planning for the aughts, well, I think we need to be planning for that change. We need to be a lot more flexible than we've been in the past, both in terms of who's coming to the community and what we're doing here. Civic renewal. Now, I was really glad to hear Carol say that. I was thinking, my God, we're all thinking alike. It's fantastic. That whole sense of civic comedy is so important. How does that happen? By building a shopping center? No. By building a hotel? A park? Maybe. But you start getting civic and cultural centers being built, and yes, all of a sudden the community starts coming together and doing things there and building upon itself what its future is going to be. And like I say, I think cultural in the future is where it's going to be in terms of development. So, questions. De la Guerra Plaza, is it our historic and cultural center of the future? What are our options going to be? And what will it take to make it happen? Okay. I'm almost kind of like going with the flow. We have the cultural art district flowing up here. We have a fun zone which has developed in there. We got the funk zone, which we still got to figure out what to do with. And then for me, I got the beach. What's missing here? The historic center of the city. And frankly, when you walk out here, I like all the qualities there, but it's not strong enough. It doesn't say this is the civic center of the community, and it needs to. Okay? Lights. Last pictures. Beautiful place. Tremendous diversity in the community. That's the De la Guerra Plaza when I first came here, of concerts and whatever on Tuesdays, right? Doesn't happen anymore. In fact, we've even lost a sense of the ownership of the space. God gave us the country. The skill of man hath built the town. Every time I walk back there, I salute it, being a planner, because in fact, we as a community have done something special here. But I can tell you that there's this whole rivalry between the locals and newcomers and tourists, right? This is the symbol of the city. When you go down to the beach next Saturday, you can always tell the locals from the tourists. Thank you.
Would you like to take a little break for 5 minutes? And the restroom is just around the corridor there. There's coffee back there, cookies. And we'll gather back together in about 5 minutes. With Dora at lunch the other day, we had a conversation about the plan of the Indies, the early aqueduct system of the Spanish and other systems, water systems in the Mediterranean, and 8-sided buildings and the Knights Templar. So anybody that can cover all that ground, it was an amazing day. And so I'm very happy to introduce to you Dora Crouch, who's written some wonderful books and is a colleague of all these great historians up here. Dora?
I have to thank Patrick for reminding me that not only my physical home, but my intellectual home is in California, and that I've been meaning to get back to Spanish colonial work. So don't hold your breath, but sometime in the aughts. Okay, I'm going to talk about the historical background of the Plaza of Santa Barbara. At the beginning, in 1782, Santa Barbara was founded as a presidio, that is, a military settlement. Then in 1786-7, the mission was established a mile or more to the west on a hill overlooking the coastlands and the port. Now I want the slide and the lights, please. Such separation of government and religious forces was deliberate along the Spanish frontier. I'm showing you a map of San Francisco where you can see the Presidio up in this corner, where it still is, and the mission over here, about 3 miles away, maybe 3.5. That was deliberate all along the Spanish frontier, next from St. Augustine in the east, down here, over to San Francisco here. And this little piece of the Spanish Empire, very thinly settled but compared to the thickness of the center of Mexico or around Lima, Peru, was nevertheless Spanish. Next, please. This is a terrible map, but you can at least see the Spanish is the dark part and the Portuguese is the lighter part. I'm assuming you know where Spain is. Next, please. And our particular interest, of course, is the California aspect of that empire. And there were three kinds of settlements in California. There were the presidios. There were, in fact, 4 royal presidios, which held down the whole coast from San Diego up to San Francisco. And there were the many missions, located, as we all learned in 4th grade, a day's walk apart, all the way up the state of California. And then there were, in the late times, the pueblos, which were civil settlements, which came sort of in the last gasp of the Spanish colonial period. Presidios were outposts of Spanish empire, founded for reasons of international politics, and to some extent, can you go back 1 or 2? Is that possible? Once more. I point out to you one oddity of that international politics. At St. Louis was the only place in the world where the English and the Spanish had a common frontier. International politics colliding in mid-America. Next, please. Thank you. That's fine. Stay with that a minute. Presidios were outposts of the empire. They were not only forts, but fortified settlements for the soldiers and their families. The missions, and I show you here a known plan of the Santa Barbara mission, they were subsidized by the Spanish crown, although they were religiously independent, but they were considered by the crown worth subsidizing because they were an independent arm of Spanish policy. Under the Habsburg dynasty, religious conversion leading to cultural assimilation was the chosen dominance mechanism. But the Bourbons, who ruled the empire after 1759, preferred military conquest. Even though that had been tried in Mexico, found wanting, and for reasons of success in conquest and inexpensiveness of conquest, the state had turned to religious conversion as the means of doing it. The Bourbons didn't have that experience because they hadn't been the ruling group then, so they didn't know that. So they thought, well, let's go for military conquest. After 1800, however, difficulties in Europe prevented them from training, arming, and supplying their frontier troops effectively. Indeed, at Santa Barbara, next please, the acculturation did not go as planned in far-off Seville. Chumash from both the village near the coast and the mission worked at the Presidio, where, according to R.L. Hoover in 1985, they were often acculturated by the soldiers at a rate faster than that desired by the Padres, i.e., taught to drink alcohol. Santa Barbara, one of the 4 major ports, was a royal Presidio. The fort was situated about a mile from the sea, halfway between the mission and the large Chumash village on the coast. Like other Presidios, the location placed it beyond the reach of cannonballs from an enemy ship. In 1783, only a year after its foundation, it had a 61-man garrison, mostly cavalrymen, but only 1 brass 6-pounder, a cannon, and 3 smaller iron pieces. That's what I mean about the Bourbons really didn't arm these people to do the job they gave them to do. By 1788, the Presidio fortress had been built, which you're seeing the plan of over here. A 10-foot high wall, that's the outer edge here, enclosing rows of all-purpose rooms on all 4 sides, with an entrance in the middle of one short side, facing the sea, and a chapel opposite it on the other short side. The 1780s design of the Santa Barbara Presidio is unlike the Monterey or San Francisco Presidios in that private gardens, these spaces here, are the gardens between the wall and the houses. Private gardens and corrals separated the row of houses from the outer wall. You had to have a place to put the horses of all those cavalrymen, right? And in other places, they tried putting the horses separately from the Presidio, and of course the Indians thought that you were giving them the horses. Next, please. Unlike Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the original Presidio, this is the plan of the original Presidio at Santa Fe, and down here in the corner is the part of the Presidio that is now the governor's palace. Originally, everything turned inwards, and you had a blank wall along the outside to make sure you were safe. And they used the roofs of the houses to walk on to reach the railing that the outer wall formed. You could shoot over the edge of. Next, please. At Santa Fe, that presidio reversed its orientation. That governor's house then, instead of opening inward, northward to the presidio itself, turned itself around and opened outward to the plaza. So it became one of the boundary walls of the civic plaza. At Santa Barbara, the presidio gradually yielded to individual decisions, such as those of the Noriega and Carrillo families, who added courtyards partly inside and partly outside the walls. Next, please. By 1847, the other families had built houses scattered all about without order according to the caprice of the owner. We're seeing here a view of Santa Barbara in 1839. You can pick out the Mission up here on the hill, and these other houses scattered all about according to the caprice of the owners. This illustration is in the exhibition, and you can look at it there. This rather relaxed attitude towards civic planning is evident in the drawing. And we find it also in other California sites in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century. Monterey, for instance, begins to scatter itself all over the landscape in the same way. When the idea of the city from the laws of the Indies as a tightly enclosed entity in opposition to the landscape begins to break down. Indeed, at Santa Barbara, it was not until the survey of 1851 that an actual Oh, I'm sorry, I've skipped a piece. Hang on. No, that's right. That they set out a plaza in the center of Santa Barbara. This provided 2 main streets, 80 feet wide, and other streets, 60 feet wide. The plaza was set at an angle of 48 degrees, 31 minutes west, and the streets agreed with it. This placement of the central plaza at an angle to the north, south, east, west meant that the streets running from it were offset also from the prevailing winds. That orientation is called for in Ordinance 114 of the Laws of the Indies, which I'll read you just a piece of. From the plaza shall begin the 4 principal streets. One shall be from the middle of each side, next please, and 2 streets, never mind, we'll get to that, and 2 streets from each corner of the plaza. The 4 corners of the plaza shall face the 4 principal winds. The corners should face the principal winds. Now, that would mean that the corners would be at 90 degrees, but actually we have a kind of a skewed version of that here in Santa Barbara where the corners are at 48 degrees. Other ordinances regulated the relation of the streets to the plaza. For instance, in Ordinance 110, it says, a plan for the site is to be made, dividing it into squares, streets, and building lots using cord and ruler, beginning with the main square, from which streets are to run to the gates and principal roads, and leaving sufficient open space so that even if the town grows, it can always spread in the same manner. And other ordinances, Ordinance 112, for instance, regulated the relationship of the plaza to the coast and the size and the shape of the plaza. The plaza should be square or rectangular, in which case it should have at least 1.5 its width. We'll talk about that more a bit later. And most of these plazas called for porticos all the way around the plaza, of which the portico of this building is a nostalgic reminder. The 16th century laws of the Indies that governed the placement of these cities and, in California and elsewhere in the Spanish world were based on theories of Alberti from the mid-15th century, who based his work on Vitruvius from the late 1st century BCE. Vitruvius had as his models the Roman army camps, which became the cores of veterans' colonies during the last century before our era, in Spain and elsewhere in the Roman world. I'm showing you here the Roman core of Barcelona, and you can see that at the center there's a place where one street comes in here and another street this way, and where they meet is the central plaza. It's still there. Next, please. That would have been an early Roman example of Spain because Barcelona is on the east coast of Spain, nearer to Italy. Up in the northwest of Spain is Leon. Here's Leon and its medieval version, but its Roman part is this hatched part, and here you have a street going through from top to bottom, and one coming in this way, and we have the open plaza there where the streets meet. ancient Roman and Italian Renaissance ideas about urbanization were available in books and in physical remains when Philip II of Spain decided to regularize the laws under which his greatly expanded domains were ruled. Next, please. Here's the chart of the influences. Well, we have back in Roman times their practice of making colonies of people with a standard plan anywhere in the empire, and Vitruvius was well aware of that process at the end of the 1st century when he wrote his famous book on architecture, which was then rediscovered by Alberti in the middle of the 15th century, and all three of those related directly to Spanish colonization and this train of thought here as well. Then from the process of Spanish colonization, we have derived things that worked, went into the laws of the Indies, and the laws of the Indies affected further colonization. Okay? They did not ever pick up Vitruvius' actual idea about what an ideal Renaissance, what an ideal city should be like. Next, please. What Vitruvius called for, we don't have any pictures that tell us what Vitruvius called for. What we have is this kind of thing, which was a Renaissance reconstruction from the words in the book of Vitruvius. Here we have the main gates, north, south, east, and west, and we have a central plaza, but then we have these streets that avoid the winds from the north, south, east, and west and go in other directions, making it very cumbersome. You come in this west gate, come on, and you can't get there. You have to go like so. Of course, that's good for baffling your enemies, but it's not too good as a practical matter. And in fact, in the laws of the Indies, they never call for anything this complicated, because Philip and his experts knew perfectly well that the people they were sending out to develop these towns were not experts. They had to have something that was real simple. So you tell them, lay out a square plaza or a rectangular plaza, lay out some streets that border those things in all four directions, and then lay out parallel streets for those. And if you get a big enough town, make smaller plazas elsewhere where you need them. That you don't need a lot of architectural or surveying experience to be able to do, and that's what they told them to do. Now this, next please. The document that they produced for doing this is called the Laws of the Indies. It was dated 1573 in the summer. This is a good page from it. And to tell you something of the kinds of problems that could enter into deciphering and translating this, let's look at the next one, which is a bad page, where the words on the back have come through, like that in that terrible map I showed you of the Spanish Empire. The words on the back have come through, and you have to figure out which words belong to which. Can you remember that in the early 19th century, when people sent each other letters, they deliberately crisscrossed their letters like this, so that when the other person got your letter, it was not only a wonderful thing from you, but it was a marvelous puzzle they had to work out for days and days. So that's what my colleague had to do. One of my co-authors on the Spanish city planning book and his wife, who's a professional translator, have now produced in a book called Hispanic Planning in North America. Does that give you an echo? It's called that echoey kind of title because it was edited by our third author, Daniel Guerra, and they have in it a complete translation of the Laws of the Indies. And anybody who's interested can come and look at that afterwards. In the Spanish city planning book, we did not put all of the ordinances in. We only put in the ones that dealt with city planning per se. So the ones that said don't kidnap the Indians and don't take them on your ships, we didn't bother putting that in because that didn't have to do with the form of the city. But in this new translation, they have all of them. And the ordinances had been translated in 1922 by a woman named Nuttall, and one gives her great credit for finding them and deciding that everybody should have the benefit of it. One only wishes that her Spanish had been a little better. Probably her Spanish was about at the level of mine, which is saying nothing. This bad page, by the way, is also in the present exhibit. Just as if we were going today, as the American people, send a group of explorers to set up a colony on the moon or on Mars, we would give them a complete manual of how to do it, wouldn't we? We wouldn't assume that even if somebody was a terrific space scientist or a microbiologist or something, they would necessarily know how to lay out a town in a colonial situation in this brand new strange terrain. And neither did the king. He finally got it through his head that letting everybody do it the way they wanted wasn't working. They better have a set of laws. These laws were first issued in 1573, as I said. They were revised and amplified about once a century. They were done again in 1681, where the original less than 150 ordinances expanded into 3 volumes, and again in 1791 where they expanded into 4 volumes. Let's go on now, please. Some of the plaza plans make clear the results of following these ordinances. In this drawing, I show you first the old world type, where you have a civic space and streets going off in the 4 directions from the middles of the sides. In the new world, the ordinances tell us 2 different things. In one place they say, do this. In another place they say, do this, have the streets going off from the corners. And it's this latter plan that the Portuguese followed in Brazil. I don't know why they picked up this one, not the other one. And in some places there are both. There are entries off the center and entries at the corners. And that matches with Ordinance 113 as far as how big the plaza should be, because you have 2 things. You have a space, and then you have what it's going to be used for. And what it's going to be used for partly depends on how many people are going to use it. If you have a sweet little group of 50 families, you don't need the same size plaza as if you have 100,000. So the laws of the Indies tell us in Ordinance 113 that the plaza should be not less than 200 feet wide and 300 feet long, nor larger than 800 feet long and 532 feet wide. A good proportion is 600 feet long and 400 feet wide. Next, please. The plazas often had colonnades around them. We're back in Santa Fe. Here's the pretty city we were talking about. Here's the governor's palace. Oh, come on, do this. Here's the governor's palace up here at the top. And you can see these dots that go around. Those are the columns of the porticos around the main plaza. At Santa Fe, we also have another nice little thing. On this side of this street that leads over to the main church, there's another portico, and the main church has a little plaza out in front of it, and it also has a portico. Portico signifies public space. So that's a very good reason to have one out in front of this building. Next, please. In many places, this is an example from Mendoza, Argentina. Especially in the 18th century, plazas got to be square more often than rectangular. And here's one where the city lots are divided up in 4 or maybe more. Whoever owns a piece of property has their name written on their property. So that's maybe 3 families there. And in many cities, you had something at the center of the plaza that says, here you are, this is the middle of this important place. According to this thing, a kind of Statue of Liberty with a cross on top, but it could be whatever your town decided. So in that sense of what a plaza was supposed to be, Santa Barbara's plaza obeys the Spanish laws in its angular orientation and its centrality. The other models for Spanish practice of urbanization were the towns and forts conquered from the Moors during the 14th to 16th centuries, and the Bastide towns of the Pyrenees area from the 13th century and later. At the end of the 15th century, next please, the Spanish rulers, Ferdinand and Isabel, had used this pattern in 1491 to build Santa Fe and Granada, a fortress town, and it became an important model for the New World. It was one of their headquarters. And you see, again, this business of the streets entering at the middle, a plaza, in this case, a church on the plaza. That's not an invariable thing. Sometimes the church has its own plaza. Next, please. And here's how it looks. You can see that the street's going off from the middle of the 2 sides, but also going off from the corners of all 4 corners. The Moorish fort, in fact, was the direct pattern for the colonial presidio. And the Roman fortress, later the town, was the pattern for the central plaza with streets flanking it at right angles. The truly impressive scale of this accomplishment in California, so far away in miles and in time from Philip's original lawmaking in Spain, may be seen in the persistence of Spanish patterns at Santa Barbara. Not only through the difficult period of colonization in the later 18th century, and the even more difficult period of disintegration of the Bourbon hold of the empire, early 19th century, but indeed well into the 19th century, Santa Barbara adhered to the Spanish way inculcated by the laws of the Indies. The Mexican government's decision in the early 1820s to secularize the missions, followed by the dispersal of the remaining neophytes. Most of the Native Americans had been killed by diseases they were not immune to, and the transfer of their holdings to Mexicans in the 1520s and 30s, were unable to dislodge in Santa Barbara this preference for Spanish culture. In the later 1840s, people from the United States took over California and went on to be taken over by California. Santa Barbara, for instance, preserved its Spanish character well into the 1870s. In fact, it was after the incorporation of California into the United States that the Plaza was surveyed here. It was in 1851 that they got around to surveying a plaza and building it, because the people who lived here were still Spanish in their orientation and their thinking, and they knew they needed a plaza. It was later, but still in that same mode, beginning in 1909, as Professor Westphal has told us, that Santa Barbara embarked on a conscious effort to make its future at least as Spanish as its past by requiring future construction in the downtown area, an activity of the 40s, as Mr. Davis has told us, to be made in Spanish colonial style, as studied at length by David Gebhardt and his colleagues. For a connoisseur, next please, nothing could be more droll and delightful than a Spanish colonial revival mailbox, next please, unless it's a Spanish colonial revival trash can. Little by little, the Santa Barbarans can make for themselves an ideal setting, next please, that incorporates the Spanish past and its modern American present, but surpasses them both. Thank you.
Well, that was great, Dora. I noticed that that was an 8-sided Vitruvian building that went by there. An 8-sided Vitruvian town.
The real question is, did they have 8-sided buildings inside the 8-sided town? I don't know. Maybe Diane Favreau can tell us that.
Okay, now we're in for a treat. Here's Robert Winter to tell us about Pasadena and Santa Barbara. So I wonder where he's going.
Maybe I better just say that. I'm trusting the changing of the slides to Kurt. I remember a number of years ago I was lecturing at the Huntington Library, and David Gebhardt volunteered to put the slides through for me. Well, he didn't tell me that he was going to do this, but he brought Ellen, his daughter, along. And she was, what was it, be about 4 or 5 at the time, and terribly cute, so David thought. So he turned the slide presentation over to Ellen, and Ellen would put them in upside down, backwards, and then when she wanted to kick her father, then we'd lose track of the slides and so on. And it was the most hair-raising experience I've ever had. So I really trust Kurt. I want you to know that. A few years ago, I gave a lecture entitled exactly the same thing, A Tale of Two Cities. I gave it in San Francisco to Oxy alumni. And naturally, I decided to compare it to the two to the lack of benefit, shall we say, to San Francisco. It's obvious, I think, to everyone that Los Angeles is in almost every way superior to San Francisco. I mean, no one in this room will doubt that 1 minute. Its architecture, the architecture of Los Angeles, its culture, its restaurants, and its climate are infinitely better than San Francisco. And when I based this idea on the fact that it was in the wintertime, and surely it would rain or be gloomy, or horrible, and so on. Well, we got up to the Haas Lilienthal house, where we were wonderful Victorian house, where I was to give the lecture, and you stood on the front porch and you looked down those streets to the sailboats bobbing in the blue waters with the sky clear and so on. It ruined the whole lecture. There was no use going on with that. Now, I don't intend to do the same thing today. For one thing, I think that the cultures of both Pasadena, this is big of me, of Pasadena and Santa Barbara are roughly equal for, of course, different reasons. Both of them are dedicated to fine architecture. Both cities excelled in architecture in the 1920s, and which is, of course, the subject of this lecture. I'm going to fill you in on the Spanish colonial revival, as if you didn't already know so much about it from David. But I have a different point of view than David does often. As you may see, we almost always agreed on the things that were supposed to go into the guides, but for different reasons. That's called friendship. Santa Barbara has the missions and the adobes, which we don't have, but we have the arts and crafts architecture, which I'd be delighted to talk to you about someday. That you are somewhat deficient in. Could I have the first slides, please, and the lights off? Yeah. Let's see, I better get this slide on here. Can I get it? Thank you. Okay. We share an intention that our public buildings be impressive. I think that's quite clear. Even if we both, in this case, I'm sorry to say this, we go to San Francisco to find the architects for these public buildings. In the case of the one to the right, it's William Moser. On the right, on the left is Bakewell and Brown, who did the Civic Center in the city of San Francisco, and then came on to Pasadena to build this huge birthday cake. That I can't really believe that anything ever gets accomplished in this building. It's too much fun, actually, but it really is. It's terrific with the garden. This is the central court with the garden and so on. I might add that as you can see in these pictures, that we also share a taste in the theatrical, and I wish to cover this a little bit later in the program. Need I point out that both Pasadena and Santa Barbara have wealth. By now it's old wealth in both cases, but even at the turn of the century, it was making itself notable. And it affects architecture. The rich do not, of which there may be some here, the rich do not always build great architecture, but I am convinced that after 75 years of living, that the rich want to do the right thing. And given the assortment of good architects, they are amazing in their ability to give us fine architecture. By the 20s, both cities were endowed with the beautiful public buildings and houses and their gardens that are among the most beautiful in the world, certainly outside of Tuscany. Another factor in common, both cities started their real lives as resorts. This one has continued to be one. Pasadena's lost its image. But both of them started being resort societies, and that is flourished in the 1920s as resort communities. Both of them represent, very seriously, a withdrawal from reality, from the real world at the turn of the century. Pasadena was founded by the Indiana colony in 1874. It was a bunch of people in Pasadena like to point this out, but it was founded by a bunch of land speculators, all of them from Indianapolis, or most of them from Indianapolis, who never set foot in Pasadena. The whole thing was land speculation, at which they were very adroit. The city took off with the coming of the Intercontinental Railroad in 1886. And by the early 90s, Pasadena was riddled with hotels, full of winter residents who often came back to build houses for their retirement. By 1920, for instance, Orange Grove Boulevard, where you see the Rose Parade goes down, it was then Rose Grove Avenue. It had 15 millionaires on it. We were very proud of that in those days, until there became so many millionaires that we can't get around to them. I'm one of them, incidentally, a retired college professor. Of course, we all know that Santa Barbara has always had the better climate. There's no getting around this. We can't get over it. And I'm a big person. I can own up to this. In 1873, the great California booster, Charles Nordhoff, wrote in his California for Health, Pleasure, and Residence, I got this from a book by David Gebhardt, incidentally, that, quote, Santa Barbara has the advantage of pleasant society. That's important. It is, in fact, a cozy nest of New England and Western New York people, many of whom came here for their health and remain because they are charmed with the climate. 15 years later, Walter Lindley and J.P. Whitney would write in their California of the South that Santa Barbara, quote, has a refined, educated, hospitable American social life. Its citizens are cultured, and many of them wealthy, having retired from business in less favored sections to spend their declining years in this Pacific paradise. Both Santa Barbara and Pasadena have a sense of being very special communities, removed from the sordid environment of Los Angeles, from Gomorrah, the big city. Pasadena, being closer to Gomorrah, has a greater difficulty in keeping away from Los Angeles, but it tries and it succeeds, for the most part, in being a separate community. Could I next slide, please? Because there's a curious tendency for the cities to, this is the point, of course, my talk, there's a curious tendency to share the same architects. As you probably know, Charles and Henry Green, and I always cross myself when I mention those names, share with Bernard Nabik and Frank Lloyd Wright the fact of being the most outstanding architects of the arts and crafts movement in America. There's no getting around this. On the left, you see the John Bent's house in Pasadena. And on the right, his brother's house in Santa Barbara. Stephen Harvey and I visited it this morning to see that it was still there. That's what we do usually in Pasadena. Before a lecture, you have to go out and see whether the buildings you're talking about still exist. These John Bent's and Nathan Bent's were, as I say, brothers, and both of them were deeply interested in Asian art. John, for instance, had an Oriental art shop in Pasadena. I'm sorry about that word. That's in quotes. It's, of course, politically incorrect to call anything Oriental anymore. This curious thing, I mustn't go too far, but I have a problem with this because you're supposed to say Asian instead of Oriental. But what happens to Occidental College in all of this mess? You see, it's quite clear that if you can't use Oriental, you can't use Occidental either. And so I have suggested to the president of the college, and he's quite serious about this, he just resigned, that he go after Bill Gates and get like $50 million, and we'll change the name of the college to Bill Gates University. This has not gone over too well with any of the faculty at Occidental College. They don't joke, they don't grin even when I say this, even though they know me, you know, from a long way back. Well, anyway, there's another curious fact that John's house was at 657 Prospect Square in Pasadena, later Prospect Boulevard. We raised the tone of all of our streets by calling them boulevards, a lot of them anyway. Nathan's address, originally in Santa Barbara, was at 1708 Olive Avenue. But after Bentz built the house, he discovered that Olive Avenue had no access at that time to the street. It was a pedestrian way, so he changed the address to his back door, which was on Prospect. So the two brothers, see, I'm trying to make as much as I can come together. Both brothers lived on Prospect. Very strange, in a totally different environment. Now, the Bentz phenomenon was, need I say, a coincidence. But in the 20s, there were even more architects who shared points of view. For instance, Myron Hunt, Gordon Kaufman, Wallace Neff, Frederick Rohrig, all of them from Pasadena, got commissions in Santa Barbara and in Montecito. And incidentally, I include Montecito today. I hope that's fair. It's as a part of Santa Barbara. The favorite Pasadenan, could I have next slide, was without a doubt the architect Reginald Johnson, who lived in Pasadena. He was the son of the Bishop of California, the Episcopal Bishop of California, with the delightful name of Joseph Horsefall Johnson. I've always attached that to the English, the falling off your horse and riding to hounds and all that sort of thing. Well, anyway, sorry again about that, but Johnson, of course, did the Biltmore Hotel. I took this rather unusual shot of it, not of the front door, of course, but because I sort of wanted to fool you about what in the heck it was. Reginald Johnson was extremely popular in this town, and did several houses. I guess I don't show you anymore, but he was popular. The Pasadenans shared that interest in fine architecture, in fine architects, no matter where they lived, by having. Could I have the next? I'm sorry. Could you go back just a minute? I'm sorry. Having George Washington Smith do 4 houses in Pasadena, all of them elaborate and very exciting houses. That architects worked in both places is easily explained. Of course, they shared, and I'm very interested in this, the fact that the cultures of Santa Barbara and Pasadena were so often shared, and that brothers like the Bences and so on, and sisters and so on, would pass the word along about their architects. It's the way they still do it, as a matter of fact, but in a somewhat more complex manner. Obviously, in the 20s, both cities shared a common interest in Spanish architecture. Could I have the next slide? This is, of course, Reginald Johnson's Jefferson house called Miraflores in Montecito. Incidentally, the garden to the right is by Paul Thien, who was a resident of Pasadena, as was, of course, Reginald Johnson. I won't emphasize this too much anymore, but I'll just go between the architects, and just know that the same architects I'm talking about. I don't care whether they're Pasadena or Santa Barbara, and it's all in the 1920s. So I hope I don't have to read out the date. Some of the dates I still don't have, but these are all 1920s, with the exception, I think maybe this one is one that is of 1919, but that's close enough. The Spanish tradition is here. Obviously, Reginald Johnson has discovered the beauty of the Spanish white walls with deep indentations, and then sometimes these deep openings surrounded by quite elaborate ornament. You can see it here. The Spanish Baroque, which is called Churrigueresque. Now, where does this Hispanicism come from? Could I have the next slide, please? Where does it come from? From a mission revival, of course, of 1895, roughly 1895 to 1915. It's a very strange phenomenon with a strong intellectual background, incidentally. For instance, one of the basic things is Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona, where she idealizes a Spanish civilization, where the Franciscans came into California, deposited missions, and then the brothers worked to get the Indians to develop their initiative, and the Indians and the Spanish lived together hunky-dory for ever and ever. Of course, we all know this is a utter fable, but it was extremely popular in the late 19th century. I think that it dates from 1884. I could find you all sorts of examples of this, including, I'm sure, Ramona Boulevard somewhere in Santa Barbara. If I really looked, I haven't looked. That just occurred to me, as a matter of fact. The problem, of course, as you can all see, is awkwardness. A bunch of things have been thrown together. A kind of mission gable has been thrown together with an Islamic tower. Of course, the Muslims never got here, but what the hell? And some other things that simply don't go together. It's a mishmash. And this is this is in downtown, near downtown Los Angeles. And the one to the right, can you believe it? It was designed by Harwell Hamilton Harris's father in Redlands. And here, the Spanish colonial revival simply got out of hand. And the thing is, that people that did this, or that saw this thing going up, recognized it themselves. Often we are critical of this period because we think we stand off and are superior. These people also saw this as very awkward architecture. But it was prevalent, for instance, especially in cities that didn't have missions. Such as the Mission Inn, for instance, in Riverside. People are always looking for the Mission in Riverside, and they never have found it. Pasadena, of course, is another one. It's interesting. I've been going around Santa Barbara late yesterday and early today, and there is some examples of Mission Revival architecture. Some of them, but they're just as awkward as what not as quite as bad as that one over there to the right, I must admit. But a lot of people recognized that these were strange buildings. This absurdity was recognized. This absurdity was recognized by lots of people. The incongruity of using details from religious architecture on domestic architecture was often commented on and ridiculed. Although these critics often agreed, and this is very significant, they agreed that while the religious architecture wasn't of any use to anyone, the adobe architecture was. Please keep that in mind when you think about Santa Barbara architecture and even Pasadena architecture. In a sense, the Mission Revival spawned its own reform. And when people talk about reform in the period architectural progressivism, that is the late 19th, early 20th century, they think of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, of course. A number of Wright's their Midwestern associates. As far as Santa Barbara and Pasadena go, Sullivan and Wright are absolutely unimportant. I know that Wright designed a house in 1909 in Montecito, but it was of no influence in Southern California architecture whatsoever. Some of the other Wright stuff was, of course. A much more vital force, could I have the next slide? A much more vital force in Southern California was Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue. I don't have time to go into this too much. I've got another lecture on Goodhue that I'd be glad to give to you sometime for enough money. But he made his name. He made his name in the East. You know him, for instance, for several churches in New York City, and particularly the West Point Chapel. It still stands. They're great monuments to Goodhue, who began in the late 19th century to winter in Santa Barbara. And this is a result. He got several commissions here. This, I think, is the greatest one, although there are competitors. This was the Gillespie House, dating from 1903 to 1905. I told you that when I get out of the 20s. James Waldron Gillespie, I forget where his money came from, but he financed a trip for him and for himself and for Goodhue to go to Persia and study particularly the gardens in Persia. You can see here what in the house what Goodhue was thinking. He was thinking classical, neoclassical. Although it doesn't show here, it's not precisely bilaterally symmetrical, but it gives the impression that it is. And with the garden, it is an impressive example of Beaux-Arts architecture, which was important in this period. French rationalism was imposed upon the Montecito countryside. It's very funny because Goodhue never went to college, and he hated the École des Beaux-Arts. But that shows you how influential it was on people in that period. He adopted it nevertheless. the gardens. I think they still exist. I think that this is off limits to most of us. I took this picture, it was around 1970. I was looking at the slide, and on the cardboard it says 1970. And David, of course, David Gebhardt got me in here. Goodhue was supposed to be Beaux-Arts, and he's supposed to be against Beaux-Arts teachings, but he could not escape its message. That is, clean up architecture, clean up the mission revival, anything else that's around that's filthy, and in a very conservative way. On the other hand, could I have the next slide? On the other hand, Goodhue was an extremely complex personality. He was an architect. That explains it, I think. He was an amalgam, in other words, of an artist and a businessman. This is very important. He was a proponent of purification and at the same time a voluptuary who believed in filling the eye with good things. We know him best, I think, for what he encouraged at the San Diego Fair of 1915. Most of it is still visible, I point out to you, in a city which is not noted for its architectural preservation. Sad enough, they tear down Irving Gill all the time. But anyway, it was in the fanciful, you can see, quite different from the classicism of the Gillespie House. This is in this fanciful Spanish Baroque, the Churrigueresque. And most of the buildings were in this mode in the fair, even though they were by other architects. This set the stage, and I use the word advisedly, stage, keep that in mind, for efflorescence of ornament in California architecture, mainly, to be sure, in public buildings. You notice the touch of Baroque in the doorway of Reginald Johnson's Miraflores, but such excesses on domestic architecture were extremely rare. He was better known, he was known also, could I, next slide please, for his setting out of the campus of Caltech in Pasadena. George Ellery Hale, who was a astronomer, was head of the Board of Trustees at Caltech. He was not actually a professor. But he, first of all, hired Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray, whom he knew from his Midwestern experience, who did this building to the right, which was called Throop Hall or Pasadena Hall, which was on the Caltech campus until the earthquake of 1971 shook it down. It's also itself this Myron Hunt building, and of course remember Myron Hunt did a lot of buildings here. This Myron Hunt building has around the doorway what looks like Churrigueresque ornament. The date is from from the period 1909, so it anticipates Goodhue. I've got to point that out. Actually, it's fascinating because it's by Alexander Calder. That is the father of the Mobile Man, and the son, of course, of the guy that did this sculpture on the top of the Philadelphia City Hall. It dates from 1915. By this time, George Ellery Hale had gone to the fair in San Diego, and he decided that Goodhue, on the left, was much better than Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray. Although, if you look closely, you can see behind that dome the Pasadena Hall, this building, which, as I say, of course, almost none of this was built. If those little kiosks there at the entrance to the university were done by the Goodhue firm. After Goodhue died, I think it was in 1924, 25. The trees were in, but of course those dumb clucks at Caltech cut them down a couple of years ago. They were getting in the way, I don't know of what, and so they cut it down. The Vulgarians will have to restore it sometime when they get it. It may be that Baltimore does a better job. I'm going to talk to him about this. Put in the trees, for heaven's sakes. And of course, now in place of the library, there's that Milliken Hall, a Milliken Library, which one of the most ghastly experiences in the history of the human race. One of my friends has a brilliant idea, he says, for changing the aspect of the Milliken Library. And I said, oh, you mean hanging vines from the windowsills? No, he said. When they have enough money to buy this, they'll adopt my plan. Well, anyway, I do keep getting off. My students tell me that I'm tangential. One of them wrote at the bottom of his evaluation form, Dr. Winter's entire life is a tangent. Oh, dear. Well, and we don't have time for that. I'm awfully sorry about that. Could I have the next slide, please? Because this shows you what Myron Hunt, who is partly responsible for the building on the right, on the previous slides, did for Pasadena, the public library. It's incredible because he usually didn't he did rather dry work. Come to the Occidental College campus, for instance, and you'll see 22 buildings by Myron Hunt, and they're all plain as the Dickens, as if Myron Hunt, I'm trying to give him a poetic point of view, as if Myron Hunt thought that the people on the campus and the trees and the flowers and so on would give the juice to the place. That's being very charitable. Actually, he was one of the finest architects for boards of trustees, for the business point of view. He gave those businessmen a place that looked like a college, but it didn't cost very much. And you always have that feeling about I've also written a little monograph on the architecture of Occidental College, which I will expand upon someday here in Santa Barbara. I'm sure I'll terribly interested in Oxy. Could I have the next slide, please? Because you notice the Myron Hunt on, which is on the previous slide to the right, is extremely plain. And I think this is where we're getting around to the Adobe architecture. I think what Myron Hunt picked up on here was a sort of different sense, in spite of the mission and so on, of what Spanish architecture in Santa Barbara should be. That is, it should be more like the Adobe. Again, this is part of the reform, getting to Adobe architecture, which clears away the sculpture of the Churrigueresque. I'm sure the authorities on Churrigueresque would like that word. This is the Osthoff House on the left in Pasadena on Lombardy, and just around the corner on Allen is the Baldwin House. They both date, of course, from the 1920s. Both are by George Washington Smith. Really handsome buildings. The Adobe look, the farmhouse look, extremely Spartan. At the same time, I emphasize this, they're highly picturesque, almost as picturesque in their own way as the Churrigueresque was. Could I have the next slide, please? Because this is another George Washington Smith house, this time in San Antonio, Texas. I don't know the story behind this, but this is a Maverick, nice name, Maverick House, or Word House. And this slide I took with David's right at my shoulder. And I took this in when we had I think it was 1970, how was it? It was after just about the time we had a meeting at the SH in Society of Architectural Historians in Los Angeles. The next year we went to San Antonio, and it was a great meeting, as a matter of fact. But of course, David and I always ducked out of those meetings. We can't stand scholarly papers. Ridiculous. Waste your time listening to that drivel, you know. And so we went out and saw this. And that picture I took with David. This one to the right I took about a month ago when I was in San Antonio. David and I couldn't get in the building at the time, but we did finally get into the building, and you can see the fantastic roof. The play of excitement, of course, is on the interior of these houses. And I wish I had some more pictures to show you. The exterior, of course, is relatively plain. Could I have the next slides, please? This is Reginald Johnson House, not far from my house, which you're all cordially invited to visit. It's arts and crafts, and therefore way out. But this house, if minus the shutters, I think would look very much like a George Washington Smith house. The plainness and so on. On the other hand, look at the front hall there with the ceiling elaborate. This was a conventional way of going about things. This is a Todd Ford house in Pasadena. Could I have the next slide, please? And a lot of you have been in this house because it's possible to get into. The people who live in it are very generous. The Steedman House in Montecito, with the highly picturesque exterior and the magnificent garden, which is, as I say, I've said it already before, it's just impossible to say what a wonderful gift these gardens are to Southern California and especially to Santa Barbara. What is behind this Spanish colonialism? These big houses with fancy interiors and plain exteriors. I asked Esther McCoy that question one time. She was an old line socialist, and she said, of course, immediately, money. Sort of leaving the word there without explanation. Esther often did that, so that you'd have to think up, you know, what does she mean? Well, I think I've gotten around to that. I assume that she was correct, but what made the wealthy go for the period revivals? The picturesqueness of them and so on. Because you remember, accompanying the Spanish colonial revival, which is sometimes called Mediterranean, incidentally, further confusing the issue, I may say, there was a Tudor revival, a French provincial revival, a Dutch, and an English colonial revival. I mean, they were all over the place in this period. These were all going on at the same time. And often by the same architects. It's interesting that often by architects who could do the Spanish colonial revival extremely well. I think the answer to the question is partly the architect's taste, and that I think needs much more study. But there's another thing that I'd like to offer to you. Could I have next slide? That is the movies. Now, I didn't just come to this conclusion. Lots of people have said that the emotion that's behind the movies and so on in the 1920s, you know, its height, it has always been considered important. David has talked to you many times about the effect of the movies and so on. But I have a friend, Mary Ovnik. Actually, I'm on her doctoral committee, so I'm stealing some of her work. Oh, dear. But who teaches in the history department at Cal State Northridge, and she has a theory. She goes on from that romanticism to point out that the movies exhibited architecture and educated the American people on architecture, such as D.W. Griffith's Intolerance of 1919. On the left, the movies train people to react to architecture, as of course all of us here do. And to the right, you can hardly see it in this light, but you can see it's a narrow street in Old Rouen, probably, and Dorothy Gish. This is the Orphans of the Storm of 1921. Dorothy Gish is running around loose there on the street. The story is that by this time the movies had so developed the notion that dark corners were full of fiends that they didn't even need to employ people to stand in the doorways. That people, you know, whenever they saw that one of these deep indentations. And so every time they warned her away from darkness and so on. And there's Lillian Gish up in the balcony trying to direct her in some way. This is an important point, though, because you see what Mary Ovnik has said is that the audiences were now trained in looking at an architecture and relating it to emotional attitudes, deep indentations, and so on, became popular. Remember, in this period of the 1920s, by the end of the 1920s, I'm going on from Mary's discovery, but remember that it's been estimated that from 20 to 30 million people went to the movies every week during the latter part of the 1920s. And they became acquainted with strong effects and demanded them in their architecture. Could I have the next slide? Because this is a quieter one. This one to the left, of course, is the Mark of Zorro. with the Spanish Colonial Revival house in the background. You see this, only, I'm not saying this is as wild as the passageway in Rouen, but this is equally picturesque and expressive. Remember, these were silent movies in the 1920s until 1927. Therefore, the scenery to be developed, and also, of course, the acting, which we consider kind of funny. Now, you know, all of that sort of thing went right along with all of these. I put on the right, as a kind of addendum, a Batchelder tile fountain. I live in the house of Ernest Batchelder, the tile man. And this is, again, to encourage you to come to my house and see the Museum of Batchelder Tiles, and also that in August, my book on Ernest Batchelder will be out, and it'll be getting closer to Christmas time. But again, to be relatively serious, this was, of course, the great age of advertising, of the recognition of advertising. And notice, the same effects are there. Maybe you can't see it too well, but there's a woman dressed in an Art Deco costume that's running around loose there in the garden, along with all those wonderful Art Deco colors and so on, which were beautifully reproduced. This dates from around 1926. And of course, could I have next slide? Because the movie magazines were full of homes, the pictures of the homes of the stars. Francis Marion and Fred Thompson built this house in the Hollywood Hills. Sorry, it's not Pasadena, but there's more room at the time in the Hollywood Hills. I picked out Fred Thompson. Francis Marion, of course, wrote scripts for William Randolph Hearst. Fred Thompson was a rival of Tom Mix for favor in the movies at this time. I mention him because he was a graduate of Occidental College, of whom we're extremely proud. He was such a goodie when he was in college, extremely handsome man, and I've tried to live up to him, but yes. He was a great athlete and won the world's decathlon championship. I think it was in 1910, and the college exploded with joy and so on. He was so goody that he wouldn't, however, perform in plays at the college. But wouldn't you know, he ended up at Princeton University training to become a Presbyterian minister. What a fate. And then he became a chaplain in World War I and was discovered by, I forget what movie star, and brought back to Hollywood, where he finally made peace with the stage. I hope I'm not overdeveloping a point here, and became this famous movie star. Well, Francis Marion describes this as she said, we went out and bought a piece of land. Well, you can see the piece of land there. It takes up most of the Hollywood Hills. And then to the right is the house as it is today. Go to the next slide, please, because the one at the left is a painting, which is, I think, just looks like stage scenery. And then interior of another house. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get good color slides of the Francis Marion Fred Thompson house. That's typical. This was a house designed by Wallace Neff, who incidentally claimed to David Gebhardt that he had worked with George Washington Smith in Santa Barbara at one time. We don't know. I asked Wally Smith, his son, just the other day, what he knew about that, and he didn't know anything. Okay, could I have next slide, please? Here on the left, you see another Wallace Neff picture. On the right, obviously, the level house of Richard Neutra. The result of this Spanish colonial revival was picturesque, pretty, and, excuse me for using this word, superficial. I hate to say that because some of you live in these houses, and you've thought that they were products of greatness, of course, and extremely important in the history of architecture, as they are from the social history point of view, but there's none of the seriousness that you see in the international style on the right of Richard Neutra's building. These buildings are simple. Please don't. I expected the rotten eggs to come at me fairly soon. And tomatoes and so on. I need some of those. There's none of the seriousness that was exactly contemporaneous with the Spanish colonial revival. There's no sermon on abstraction or on the nature of new materials. They're just fun and eminently livable. An architecture of an entertainment, as a historian has put it, David Van Zanten has put it. And that's not all bad. Van Zanten says in an article, which incidentally he wrote right alongside an article by David Gebhard in the Journal of New Mexican Art or something like that. I'm sorry, I could find it later, but Van Zanten says the teens and the 20s in America were the age of movies and advertising, of Chicago, Los Angeles, and Detroit, the time when American culture became systematized, commercialized, and devoted to entertainment. And these decades produced an architecture of entertainment. This culture was America's gift to the world, and it is illuminating to see in the realm of architecture how it expanded to dominate some of the more respectable and intimate aspects of life. Van Zanten goes on to note that the same thing was going on in classical music at exactly the same time. In music, he says, during these very years, mere entertainment was the stated objective of Eric Satie, of Maurice Ravel, and of Francis Poulenc. In building, it produced a witty background architecture to brighten up the new industrial cities. But it did not produce anything more than this. It did not produce a style of contemplation and of profound harmony between form and function. As I say, some of you may be shocked by this interpretation of Spanish colonial architecture. You've been trained by Pearl Chase, who incidentally was in one of my lectures here earlier. I can't remember what the lecture was about, but I can certainly remember Pearl. No one will ever forget that extremely strong woman who disagreed with something I said. At that time, I was much younger and unable to take that sort of thing. It was really pretty sad. Let me tell you something that is funny and also enlightening. David Gebhard, the leader of the Spanish colonial revival, the Pope, as he was called, in Santa Barbara, agreed completely with David Van Zanten. He had, Kurt gave me this article. In 1962, he wrote an article for the Santa Barbara News Press, that is, David did, just after taking his job at UCSB. And after he'd seen the Spanish colonial revival buildings here, and pointed out that most of them had very little to do with the Spanish tradition in, in Santa Barbara. In fact, he called them, I remember this very well, he called it instant history. It's wonderful. Their products, these things with the tile roofs and so on, and beautiful gardens, he called the Spanish colonial revival a delightful hoax. That's a quote from David. In fact, he said, they were essentially sophisticated stage settings, visual devices which encouraged their occupants to escape from the day-to-day reality of their world. See how close that is to Van Zanten? That was 20 years before Van Zanten, when they may have been in cahoots, I must admit. David Gebhard was speaking as a historian, and that's very important. He was speaking as a historian and not as a voluptuary. He was looking at history for, what it is, without, it's sort of like a scientist going after facts, no matter where they may lead. And I, of course, you know how much I admire David Gebhard. Just looking at these two buildings, Richard Neutra and Wallace Neff, we can see the difference, perhaps too radically. David wrote in 1967, when he was taking the hoax more seriously, I may point out David was a complex person. He said that the visual leap from the Spanish colonial revival building to the modern was not a great one. I never was able to understand how David could come to such a point of view. Just simply looking at it with the naked eye suggests they're totally different buildings. They're being white and sort of geometrical and so on. Doesn't make, well, I'm sorry, David. I'm getting away with myself. But anyway, the buildings have in common whiteness, but almost nothing else. But remember, David was drawing attention to the tendency in the 20s to simplify, to pare away to essentials, a sense of architecture as geometry. And that, I think, remember, he was a teacher. And you say, as a teacher, you sometimes say these extravagant things in order to jounce people up and start a good quiz section. It really turns people on. I hope that I'm not muddying the waters when I point out that David was a complex personality, like Goodhue. He was not always consistent. He was also a teacher and also a scholar, I may point out. He could at the same time present a building as a hoax, and also remember what he said about that, a delightful hoax. How often those of us who knew him heard the word delightful. 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 You know, that was what, he liked that. He hated to be bored. And he liked people who were delightful too. And he showed them that he liked them. He could, as I say, present building as a hoax and also as delightful. And that is a word that he so often used when he saw a building that challenged the ordinary or a person. Naturally, I think that should mean a lot to us. Could I have the next slide, please? Because many of you know that David Gebhard was mostly responsible for converting Caltrans to the Spanish colonial revival in the State Street Bridge. And let me tell you, he was so proud of that. It's unbelievable. He brought it up, and every time you'd mention it, his eyes would glitter, and so on. How partly it was winning the victory over Caltrans, which is something else, and so on. I would like to suggest to you that you people in Santa Barbara immediately start a movement to call this the David Gebhard Memorial Bridge, and put a bronze plaque on it or anything else like that, and realize that it's delightful. Thank you.
Well, that was delightful. And now for our concluding presentation, I'd like to present to you somebody who doesn't work with stage sets, but whenever the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation finds a need to work in the real thing, Adobe, this is the person that we turn to, Wayne Donaldson.
Thanks, Patrick. That's not fair, Bob. I got cramps from laughing so hard here. So did I. Well, it was sort of fun to see Dave show up the plan from Simon Eisner. I actually worked for Cy and Lyle Stewart and Jack Mosier back in '64, so that's 35 years later, so it's kind of fun to come back. I'm going to take a different spin on this, mostly from an architect's complicated point of view. Thank you, Bob. And we're going to talk about the plaza as meant for the common man, okay? So what is the plaza, the mall, the park, the green, the square, the garden, the pleasure ground, or quite frankly, the commons? It's really what we're talking about. And if we look at the common man, we're looking at the populace, the rank and file, the third estate, the masses, the mobs, the multitudes, the public, or quite frankly, the people. Not the aristocrats, the elite, or the nobility. So my opening comment, I'm going to let you figure out what gringo means as we go through this. But one thing I found during the past few years is that the planning of the traditional plaza is usually by the elite for the common man. We normally overemphasize its importance to the nobility. We overanalyze it. We over-design it by importing nationally known gringos to come in. myself being one. We over-commercialize it, and then once, when we finally get it built, we over-regulate it. And therefore, we don't use it, and perhaps we don't even need it. And I don't know how many times you've said, hey, meet me at the Plaza. I don't do it in San Diego, and yet we got a wonderful Plaza by Irving Gill. So let's go through the slides real quick. I know it's getting late, and we'll try to finish this up. There, turn off the lights. This is a picture of Monterey, about 1842, and right underneath that says, before the gringo came. And I love that little, and that's the note that we bring home. And as we heard, it's really a scattering of the places all over the landscape, but yet you can still see where people would meet, where the plaza would be. And sure enough, 9 years later, at Cave Couch's home, which he calls Ramona's home, where Helen Hunt Jackson wrote her famous book, Cave Couch in 1851 built his feeling of romantic or fantasy land, California. At the same time, the Crystal Palace was coming up with its World Exposition in London, which was really promoting the neo-technical portion of Europe. Now, if we regress 100 years at the Central Square, and I'm going to mispronounce this because I couldn't even get it out of Bob, Wigtech Dusted, the 1745 watercolor really shows what the commons were meant for that time. You see two wonderful little wellheads, one there and one at the end of the street. You have a flanking of trees that are marked by a roadway that denotes passiveness, a roadway as we're seeing coming in from either side on the more New World Square. But notice how it's visited here by the aristocrats, standing so proper and trim, with just a little hint of carriage coming into the commons. As we have from this engraving by Paranitsky showing the Spanish steps from Strada Felici to this part of Rome, this is when Louis XVI, Sextus V was really looking at bringing water to Rome with this wonderful boat fountain that he put in a series here as the Spanish steps lead from the upper street coming down. But the neat thing about this plaza, again, is completely enclosed by buildings. No roadway really coming in, although carts and other people got in there. This is a real place for the common man, not only to get water, which was the primary source, but also to meet one another. 1783, as Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette provided this big stage for the common man as the launching of the Montgolfier balloons really set the stage for how the commons can be used. This wonderful thing, again, with a clock tower of all things in the center of the square, and how you can actually get up on higher levels to look down as people look up with this wonderful gradation of how the plaza comes down from the high point to level. So you can always see people while they're not seeing you and vice versa. As we're looking at medieval Tallinn in Denmark, this is an 1833 lithograph. At this time, Lewis and Clark had already went up the Missouri. Pollution and urbanization was coming apart, and everybody was looking towards Tahiti, sort of a front runner for Santa Barbara at this time. But notice the adjoining houses now in the square where all the roads would meet of commerce. We find now little kiosks, little cubby holes, little food places, little things now built onto the side of buildings that would serve the commoners. So whatever the trade was at this time now proved to be lucrative. Again, going back to the commerce, as we heard Bill say. And pretty soon now we start seeing the squares filled with, in fact, the common folk. And in Paris, we have a publicity poster for Le Petit Journal. And notice how it's just filled. Again, this is where the commoner would get their news at this time and be able to come and see what the current events were right outside of the newspaper and talk about the local politics. Notice in the front, the dress is all of the aristocrats coming in, fine clothes, but then ever so often you find the intermixture of the commoner coming in, the person from the butcher shop. So it was a real mixture of place for both the commoner and that. But let's return back to the States. And the coming of the railroad, especially the Santa Fe route, which just struck down the four big, great railroads and offered from $1 from St. Louis out to San Diego and Los Angeles and these ports, which really then promoted the trend from thinking about something as magical to being systematic, to understanding. Once steam replaced wind, then we had the format that we could actually plan things and count about it on time. 1886 looks very much like the picture that Bill showed you. This is downtown San Diego, the boom of the 80s, and again we also had our rapid transit coming right down the middle. And we also had at that time the problems of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, very popular during this time, and although it was really the entertainment plaza that he would bring to people, he really thought what he was doing was educating the masses as to the authentic Wild West in terms of the Indians, what they actually look like, and some of the unique rescues that actually historically took place. About this time, we also had the Chicago Exposition in 1893, our 400th year celebration, and the City Beautiful movement moving on and really starting to change the architecture. Also a great amusement spot at this time, Coney Island opens and becomes the first amusement plaza with Ripley's Auditorium happening. That's odd with ODD. Unfortunately, the 1905-1906 earthquake and fire of San Francisco really had San Francisco's City Beautiful movement terminated overnight. But notice where the commoners pick up their rations, even though there's a few soldiers guarding around, they pick it up in the plaza. And then Santa Barbara. The Mission revival style of Francis Wilson Station there really started to set the stage as the old locomotive comes in. And at this time, it was more of a pastoral scene, promoted by the railroad to create a green grass, palms, the kind of the fantasy land as a person would come out here from Minnesota in the dead of winter, said, how can you beat this place? But yet we would sit outdoors and we would work outdoors. And then as we also heard is that Bertram Goodhue, 1915 Panama Exposition started. And you'll notice this great stopping over as we come through the isthmus. Again, all roads lead to San Diego. They don't stop Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They continue on up to Portland and Seattle. So this was a promotion of first protocol. And again, a gringo, Bertram Goodhue, came in, stole it away from Irving Gill to design the 1915 Expo. But where did the common man go? He didn't go to all the other great exhibits and the museums that was starting the collection period that we had in the States at that time. They went to the isthmus, the amusement street, the Panama Canal on the left, and, and the Panama California Exposition was promoted through the isthmus. This is where you would find your cultures, whether it be from Hong Kong or Ripley's, believe it or not, the gigantic mushrooms, or a lighthouse from Maine, or a little type of Indian village in the hillside. This was also the first thing to be torn down by the aristocrats after the fair was over. At the same time, we had the great amphitheaters, the Neo-Grecian at Santa Catalina Island, for those that could afford to go across or paddle across. The amphitheater then provided the entertainment, the acts, the plays that was so graciously given by the Wrigley Corporation. You'll notice this is before the casino was built out here on the point. Also Laguna Beach. This became then the plaza for the masses. You have your boardwalk, which was an open arcade. You had the nice tilted slope of the sand beach that provided viewing while not being viewed. And of course the gigantic water fountain out here, the Pacific Ocean. Or you could go inside and do the plunge if you couldn't handle salt water and you're from the east. As we kept looking places for the common man, this is a joyriding, the California alligator famine in Los Angeles. This is dated 1919, so it predates almost some of the movies happening here. But you have to remember, this is what was happening for a lot of the entertainment coming down where people would meet other people. And only 3 years later, then, we have James Osborne Craig and George Washington Smith's plans for Casa de la Guerra with the parking spaces and everything as we're planning Santa Barbara out. However, more importantly happening at this time, especially overseas, another gringo, Le Corbusier, really Swiss, working in France, comes up with a plan for the center of Paris. You notice the gigantic plazas, the movement of masses and people, but more importantly, his concept on the radiant city. as an alternate to human spa. Again, with plazas down below where these poor little guys are staggering over and just kind of aimlessly walking around the plaza. He has this great kind of a, I guess this is a airport out here, at least those are biplanes sitting there. They must have a hell of a climb ratio to get through the buildings and stuff. But I wonder that if people really can communicate well in a vertical line as much as they can on a horizontal sidewalk or plaza. Again, at this time now, you have Santa Barbara coming in as age. We also find that part of the expositions that were being planned later in the 30s really were starting to get their roots early on in the game. And they started to get it, most of all through the movies, as we heard, through cultural tourism, and that at this time in 26, right after the earthquake in 25, when finally Santa Barbara decided to be really fantasy and go Spanish revival, is that the national parks now opened vistas with the automobile. The age of collection was well on its way, and with the National Park Service was founded mostly inspired by the movies. We also have one of the first miniature golf courses, and where would you think it would be open? Well, it's Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places. 30 million tourisms. They found that golf was popular back in that time, and as people were going to the east and from the west in their automobiles, they could stop by for a nice miniature game of golf. This was only had 5 holes, which is kind of a mysterious thing because we've always played golf with the normal number of holes, but everything looks sort of like a trap. But you notice in the back there, the new clubhouse that was built, again, sort of an adobe structure with the vigas sticking out through here, just to capture part of the historical flavor of Albuquerque, although being a brand new building. And of course, the first drive-in, which I call the Automobile Plaza. This is where you could come and meet your people in this. This was 1932 was the first one that was patented. It had swings for the kids up front, or if you wish, you could get out of your car and sit with somebody if you just couldn't handle sitting back in your car because you had to hear the speakers to begin with. Great little innovative to keep the bugs out of the camera and all these wonderful neotechnic inventions in order to really help you get to the movie and the automobile. And then, of course, the other drive-in movies now, which are no longer becoming movies because now they're swap meet plazas, aren't they? This is where you can go, the commoner can go meet other ones. They never ever buy anything. It's all new junk anyway, but you can still go and meet your people and talk about what Betty is doing with Hank and everything else. But the nice thing about these early movies in the 50s, this is 1950 built, is that now you could really be convinced of what was the true history with the epic historical movies like the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston and How the West Was Won with Debbie Reynolds. These were wonderful things to really tell you how the real history was won out here. However, the shopping was still on Main Street, as you can see from Brady, Texas in 1948, and it continued as the nation's marketplace plaza from the 20s all the way through the Depressions. Very similar to a 1924 London scene by the British City Life Assurance Program showing the dangers of the road. Again, very much like the plazas that you would see earlier with the horses and everything now, but now these are people having to cross. So all these are little bill signs saying, get your insurance, don't get ran over. But again, this is where everyone met at that time. Nowadays, like El Cajon Boulevard in 1982, you don't dare go out there and just kind of talk to one another out in the middle of the street as the cars go around you. You think you're nuts. Also, in terms of how we have to take care of public property, this happens to be in Riverside, which was one of the first streets to be closed. Actually, their main street in Riverside closed in order to provide and promote, as we heard Bill say, to promote really commerce at this time. But it says conduct on public property. Conduct on public property, yada, 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 yada. 1, you cannot walk, stand, sit, or lie upon any monument, vase or vase, decorated fountain, drinking fountain, bike rack. I always really sit on bike racks all the time. Trash receptacles, medium. I'm sure most people don't even know what the heck that is. Fire hydrant, street tree planter, berm, another weird word. Utility cabinet. I sit on a lot of utility cabinets, railing, fence, planter, or upon any other public property not designed or customarily used for such purposes. Now, somebody forgot something, and so they added 2. walk, stand, or lie upon any public lawn or planted area which is posted with signs that forbid such conduct, or 3, walk, stand, or lie upon any public bench. I guess I can jump up and down on all this crap because it doesn't say I can't. So here's a kid with his mother peeking over the rock. He's messing around in the water where he shouldn't be and stuff and just having a blast. However, the rest of this plaza is dead empty. There is nobody there. And all of the businesses that front that particular plaza in Riverside is all gone out of business. Why is that? Okay. Is this a citizen of the third estate? Or as Bill noted, does this guy love his city? So what did we do? We turned ourselves inside out. Our plazas then became inside plazas where we could sit and meet, but now we're on, as Bill was saying, private property. We're not public anymore. Therefore, the commoner then is really left to the merchants and how they want to treat their own private property. However, that didn't stop us from developing the plazas. We decided to take the Penn Plan from 1683, which is illustrated right in here, which still exists in Philadelphia, and hook it up with other plazas with major high-rise buildings to sort of open the greens as sort of the 60s image then to produce plazas for the common man, but do the linkages. Again, much like Bill was saying, except on a much grander scale of linkages, so you could walk in and around, look at look at the Penn Plan from 1683. Or we said what Dora was in. This is about twice as long as the plan that the Indies said. This is Rockefeller's Empire State Plaza in Albany, New York. It is a plaza on a 6-story high platform, 1,700 feet long by 600 feet wide. And again, is that really a plaza? Or we find a more innate plaza, and that's done by that great Italian architect Charles Moore, the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans for the Italo-American community. And I could count at least 5 Roman architectural orders here: Tuscan, Ionic, Corinthian, Doric, and what I see, the Delicatessen order somewhere in there. This is a postcard from 1951, one of my favorite squares of all time, Pershing Square. Traditional with the fountains and the meeting of people, people walking through it, meeting one another. You can also have, say, whatever you want to do against the government or the aristocrats at this point. This is a few years ago, containing all of the common things, the radial walkways, the monuments, the fountains that occur, and of course the underground parking center. Well, they felt this wasn't good enough, so they went out and decided to go out for an architect to come up and design something. And the architect was Sight, and they decided to base their architecture on what they got from the people. They went out to the people and they heard workshops, and they had lots of workshops and stuff. And what they said is they want a real plaza for all the people. They want shade, lots of foliage, places to sit, eat, meet friends, a secure place, no large buildings on the site, a reflection of the spirits, the variety, and the creativity of Los Angeles. So this is the new plaza now for Pershing Square, and you notice that it's undulating surfaces. Goes up and down, around, and what was it based on? It was based on the greater Los Angeles topography. I'm sure we could all make that instant jump as we go down to the old Pershing Square, and I'm not sure where Pasadena is. It's probably somewhere up here. But it was to, have the symbolic of the cultural landscape, the Chicano East, the Black Southwest, the Asian Midtown, and the Caucasian West. It also had an interesting restaurant called the Crystal Palace, and again, it had its fountain, its place to meet, and again, a few monuments. So it had all those great ingredients of the earlier ones, but what made it even more unique is in the sidewalk was cast this aluminum thing on a grid so that it looked at night, just like what you would see from Mulholland Drive. Okay, so the image then that we have here of the typical plaza, the fountain, place to get news, place to meet people, the monuments, the raised area up here where you could look down without being seen and vice versa, and of course all these great little pigeons around. But they're just wonderful things that you have then on the traditional plaza. Now let me finish with just one case here, and this was our own Horton Plaza in San Diego. This is how it started in 1853. Started as Horton's Plaza down there. Again, a horrible little fountain. Didn't have any running water or anything. You just have to pour it and then it evaporate and you pour it back in. But we had some benches. We also had some fences to keep the horses away from eating the stuff and getting sick. The little gate. So we had sort of a little plaza that was in front of Horton's house. Again, this was downtown San Diego, the spot to be. It also was the spot that everything either started or ended at. So a parade, it would either start down at the water or it would start to the east, but it would always terminate in front of the plaza, and then all the nobility would get up there and speak down to the commoners and the horses and everybody else that's down here in the streets. So it provided a real nice place for the San Diegans to meet. Then it started to get cleaned up again as we went through the years, and we had a band shell, which was then common. You see this in almost all of the Mexican type of plazas, a place that could be entertained, again, for the commoners. There's no grass there, and the city guard band really play the music, fun, festival. And then along came Irving Gill. And Irving said, we got to have a fountain, but we're not just going to have a common fountain. We're going to have the first electric fountain in the U.S. So he designed this electric fountain. Everybody thought he was crazy in 1910, which is 12 years before we had some of the other Plaza de la Guerra being thought of. And once it started, everybody stood across the street at the U.S. Grant Hotel as the switch was thrown, and sure enough, nobody got electrocuted, so they all walked across the street to take a look at this fine fountain. Again, the fountain and the park was dedicated to the citizens of San Diego, and it's actually inscribed on the top of the fountain that's up there. Again, more of the classical design that was there, very much like Winslow's design, especially his southern portion for Casa de la Guerra, the common forms, the fountain, places for the monument, and again, palms at this time planted by Kate Sessions, very well-known horticultural in San Diego, and again, surrounded completely by streets, not necessarily isolated. Very classical forms, benches, places to seat, a little water on the ground, no big thing. Well, one thing that was really nice before Ernie Hahn came to town is that every Saturday they would have the regulars, the third estates, the commons, the plebs, and they would have their Saturday tournament with croquet. So they would put out the croquet, some of them would dress a little bit nice, and they would play their croquet, which they invited anybody to come. And also we had sort of the rank and file, the Hare Krishna would also be there. So this was really then the plaza that was owned by, worked by the commoners. And at night we had all the great formulas. We had shopping, 5 and dime cent store. We had a couple theaters that were here. And we also had a lawyer's place. So if you got sued or whatever, you could go. But this was a place, even at night, we had transportation from both rail car and bus and automobile. So it was a wonderful place to be. In steps Ernie Hahn. He's building a new shopping center, which he stole the name. It's now called Horton Plaza, so we're left with Horton Plaza Park. So now it's become Horton Plaza, the shopping center, and we decided to do it by committee. So everybody got together and said, what would you like your plaza to be? So we got out the Cheerios and the Rice Krispies and the Wheat Thins and all this and the flag and magic markers and flow pens, and everybody came up with their design and gave that to our gringo, and he went up to Big Sur and then came back and told us what it was going to look like. And this was his new design now for Gill's fountain. First, he couldn't destroy the fountain. It was just too popular, so he decided to move it over to the corner, create a lawn here, pay homage to some of Kate Sessions' original trees, so we just uproot them, but it needs a little bit more formality to it in here. And then we need a little bus shelter over here, a clock tower, and an arcade. So that was sort of the pretty picture, as we heard today. And then we got the beautiful rendering, which was wooed and awed and stuff, while all the rest of us held our breath and as our hearts stopped beating and stuff. And then the wonderful, beautiful model that we needed. Again, there's poor Gill's fountain sitting over here. And we decided, why not just keep it historic? as it was done in 1910. And everybody said, wow, that's a brilliant idea. You know? So we decided to look at some historical pictures, and although most of the aristocrats were not too happy, especially people like Ernie Hahn with their new shopping center, but then we restored it, and it became wonderful. And then we found in Gill's drawings, to keep water from splashing, is he had a little areometer here. So when the wind would blow, this thing would spin around, and the fountain spray would go lower. And then when there was no wind, the fountain spray would go higher. So he had already thought of that back in 1910. We actually planted the grass. We put the benches back. We thought this was really cool. And at night, we even restored this horrible Christmas tree light program that we have, which would go red, green, blue, and yellow as it's spinning around. But again, this was part of Gill's original design for 1910. And then all of a sudden, we got the CCDC, the Central City Redevelopment Corporation, and they decided that the commoners are now coming back to the plaza. That was not good. They were sitting on the grass, doing their croquet, playing around again. This was public property, couldn't be regulated. So they decided to plant the heck out of this. And again, this is nice because this is native California, not the traditional Irving Gill lawn, but traditional native California from some parts of California. I'm really not sure. And then everything else was kept the same. So now as we peer through here, as we see the common man enjoying, sitting on the grass, wandering a beautiful fountain with Kate Sessions trees and stuff, now we have to look through this dense forest. So as we're coming down, and we see these two young kids sitting on their mountain bike here in the spirit of 1782, they're probably saying, "What's up, gringo?"
Well, I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of all of you to thank our panelists for these wonderful, if long, presentations, and thank you very much. And sometimes, although we were far afield from the world of the plaza, I'm sure we learned very much. And remember, our goal here today is to sort of raise our consciousness about some of the things to think about when we think about our own plaza. Now, I think, Edward, you've got the magic scientific equipment that will allow you to ask a question of panelists or yourself, or make a small, quick comment. No 45-minute dissertations here. So does anyone have anything, a question they'd like to direct to one of the panelists, since we have them here?
Yeah, why don't we go to the Casa and they can buttonhole us over there.
All right, so I invite you all over to the Casa de la Guerra, where we've organized. Well, we have a question. All right.
I learned this from Oprah.
Very good.
I'm a landscape architect and designer, and anything I start with always starts with a program, and that form follows function. And I didn't hear much of that in terms of what was presented here, but I have to think back. We look at the agoras, and the agoras took the shape that they did because of what went on there. We look at the Roman plazas. You were talking about the plan for the West Indies, all that. And the way the roads came in and the Roman plazas and all that, I would think had to do with how the military came and assembled or whatever went on there. And although those images and those forms are authentic and they're the way a Spanish plaza looks, I don't think that in going into the aughts and the next millennium, we're going to be, I don't know, I may be wrong, it may be Tiananmen Square again. We might have army troops assembling, but I think when we look at De La Guerra Plaza, it's really important to say, what does the city want this to be? If it is going to be part of our historic and cultural center, what sort of things are going to go on there? Dave was talking about the concerts we used to have every Tuesday afternoon. So maybe this is just cautionary that I was over at De La Guerra Plaza and there's some beautiful images there. But given a lot of those images, if I went there or tried to do something there, I don't know that the room that we created would support the activities. You can have a very beautiful living room, but if you don't have couches and furniture in there for people to sit and talk in, I think it's really important before we get too much further in this process that we remember that form follows function. If anybody wants to comment or feedback on that.
There's a definition from the 14th century. So it's been around, what, 600 years? That works very well here. It comes from Pietrus Percorius, who's a Frenchman, who is very enamored of the kind of civil life that can be conducted in the communes, in the free cities. And he says, he defines a plaza, or a platea. A plaza is an area in the center of a city, open and free of obstruction, so that a person staying there for a while can understand the condition of the world, which is really quite nice.
Anybody else?
Patrick, I'll just, sorry.
First of all, I want to really thank you for an incredibly wonderful afternoon. And this is really directed both to Patrick and Dave, because I guess the rest of you are going to be going home. But what's next?
Well, the simple part is that we have within the council's budget a proposal basically to continue the planning effort. We consider this to be phase one, and it's an educational phase. I think phase two, we'd be looking actually at sitting down with the community and talking about Billy's question as to what is the plaza and what does it mean to us and where we're going from there. I think we've got money budgeted this year, or at least requesting for the next year, both in the general fund and the redevelopment budget. The person who has lots of the ideas, though, is this gentleman sitting right here. I mean, he keeps beating me up in the mornings, basically saying when we're going to get moving, when we're going to get going. We've been kicking around a lot of things for a lot of years. I don't know, I'll just tell you something which we've talked about, and, float that out there because you never know where a seed might grow. We've got all this space over here in City Hall parking lot and the News Press parking lot, and they've got one over there. Patrick's got the plan to basically put the adobes back in, complete the plaza, maybe punch it out to State Street, right? Do some mixed use across the street in the parking lots here. Combine that parking into public parking and take the parking out of the plaza itself. Close De La Guerra Street, right? Lots of different ideas. So we have a lot of talking. Patrick?
Well, all those sounded really good to me. Anyone else want to make a comment?
Patrick, I was out at Costco the other day, which I guess is our new public plaza or private plaza, and I was thinking, this is not a place I want to be in an earthquake. So maybe that's one of my definitions of what a good plaza would be. A good place to be in an earthquake.
Sounds like open space to me.
I just want, we have been reminded today very eloquently about the public nature of plazas, that they have always been intended to serve the public's needs. And I would just urge all of you city planner folks to remember that, that it is not the needs of commerce that are served by a plaza. It is not the needs for order. So, when I came in, I thought, well, maybe it'd be easier instead of going through this process just to put a machine gun nest up on top of City Hall and get rid of all the bums that way. Sometime I feel that that's the purpose of all this, is just to find a way to keep the public out when the public isn't as attractive as we would like it to be. I urge you to remember that the public comes in all shapes and sizes as well as colors, and that in Santa Barbara we want the plaza to remain a place for all of the public.
Could I say something to that? I think it's important from a historical perspective to think of a plaza as something that provides, as its most valuable contribution to public life, a space that isn't full of stuff. Therefore, a space that can be used in a lot of different ways. When you start putting a lot of stuff in it, even if it's beautiful trees, even if it's beautiful fountains, even if it's grass lawns, whatever you're trying to fill it up with, that precludes other kinds of activities. And if you look at the successful plazas down through history, they have an edge and they have an empty space. And it's not too big.
I would like to make a comment about the homeless or whoever else is on the plaza, the people that are on the plaza. We were talking about the historical origins of plazas, and I know that reading Plato and Socrates especially, using examples in his dialogues and wanting to talk about wisdom and all, often used the homeless that were on the Acropolis or wherever it was he was visiting to give us another thought, to always be testing someone. So there's a lot of wisdom to be found in a lot of different places, and that's where Socrates found his.
You know, I'd like to just comment on Mickey's question too, or comment more than a question. And I agree, because, you know, again, when I came here, there were benches and there were concerts and there were things going on there, and there were homeless folks too. And it was a real mix of things happening, and that was very nice. And as this reaction to this other issue, social issue, happened, the benches went out, concerts went out, and pretty soon it's a really, while it is a plaza, it isn't a place where people want to be. Anybody wants to be.
And of course, you could argue that there are other solutions to homelessness, like providing homes.
And income and all of that. I was actually going to use a slide, and it didn't fit into the kind of tenor that I had here today, but I just went to, it's not a plaza, it's a monument. It's the FDR monument in D.C. I said I went back there. And the thing that got me was the wall for the Depression, and just talking about homelessness and all of that, and the roles of plazas and civic centers. Again, remember, go back to what I said. I thought the thing we needed to do was create a civic center. That means a place for everybody. The civic being the body politic, which for all the people that are here. But it says something on that wall, something to the degree of, and I'm going to your question on commerce, is where I'm going. And, you know, we build Paseo Nuevos, we build hotels and all this kind of Fest Parker types of things. We also build parks and we build streets and, you know, hopefully we help build schools. But it said that the measure of our progress as a people is not whether we increase the wealth of those who have much, but whether we can provide enough for those who don't. And it just said everything. And that's what I'm trying to say is, like, of what we do with our efforts from a public standpoint. And I've got a $30 million bond issue Council's going to be considering in the next couple months. That's it for the redevelopment agency for the next 25 years, right? Longer than I'm going to be around probably. And the choices we're going to make here, right? What are we supporting? The civic life of the community, or, right, ... What are we supporting? And that was my question. That's why I left it out there hanging.
Could I add something to that? If you want to see a disaster area, all you have to do is to go to Los Angeles and see what happened at Pershing Square by La Guerra, who literally pushed all of the unfortunate people out. And I think an additional, if you excuse the expression, created something extremely ugly.
Well, I promised the city that I would be we would be leaving at 5 to go over to the reception, so the time has come. I think we concluded that the plaza has to be for everybody, so that's a good place to start. Now, I invite you all over to the Casa de la Guerra. We'll have a reception over there, something to nibble, something to drink, and that's where all the information is on the history of the plaza, all these wonderful drawings and model. So please spend a little time to learn about that, and then we'll see you again the next time we talk about the plaza.